Hello everyone and welcome back to Spook Speaks. I know many of you tune into these videos to help you to sleep, so I thought it would be a fun idea for everyone to share where you're listening from in the world. Feel free to drop a comment below, and if you enjoy the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now get cozy and relaxed. Let's begin. Story 1. The rain lashed against the window as I stepped into the dimly lit corridor of St. Augustine's Psychiatric Hospital. It was my first night shift, and the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead did little to drown out the eerie silence of the place. The building had a way of making you feel watched, even when you were alone. I tightened my grip on the clipboard in my hand and made my way to the nurse's station. Dr. Warren, the attending physician on call, sat at the desk, his face illuminated by the harsh glow of a desk lamp. He looked up as I approached, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp, like he was sizing me up. "Claire Dawson," he said, checking the roster. "First night shift. Welcome to St. Augustine." "Thanks," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. He handed me a clipboard with a single patient file attached. The name at the top read, Evelyn Mercer. "You'll be monitoring room 17 tonight," he said, his tone clipped. I glanced at the file. It was disturbingly thin, just a few pages of basic information. Evelyn Mercer, age 48, no known next of kin, found wandering at the site of a residential fire, physically unharmed but unresponsive. "She hasn't spoken since she got here?" I asked. Dr. Warren shook his head. "Not a word. She doesn't respond to questions, doesn't acknowledge people, just stares. We've run the usual tests, nothing physically wrong with her, but something's not right. Keep an eye on her vitals, log anything unusual, and don't..." He hesitated, his mouth tightening. "Just don't push her. Understood." A chill ran down my spine at the way he said it. Understood. I headed down the hallway, my sneakers squeaking faintly on the linoleum. The hospital was quiet, the kind of silence that made you hyper-aware of every little sound. The buzz of the lights, the distant hum of machinery, the occasional creak of the old building settling. When I reached room 17, I paused outside the door. The air felt colder here, as though the temperature dropped a few degrees the closer you got. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The room was dimly lit by the faint glow of the bedside monitor. Evelyn sat upright in the bed, her back perfectly straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her face was pale and gaunt, her hollow eyes fixed on the far corner of the room. She didn't turn to look at me when I entered. "Good evening, Evelyn," I said, my voice soft as I stepped inside. "I'm Claire. I'll be looking after you tonight." No response, not even a flicker of acknowledgement. I approached cautiously, checking the 4 line in her arm and glancing at the monitor. Her vitals were steady, almost unnervingly so, as if she were in some kind of perfect stasis. "Do you need anything?" I asked, even though I knew she wouldn't answer. Still nothing. She just sat there, staring at that same corner. I followed her gaze, but there was nothing there, just the pale green wall, cracked slightly near the ceiling. I turned back to her, feeling a growing unease. "Well," I said, trying to sound lighthearted, "if you need anything, just let me know." As I turned to leave, the overhead light flickered, plunging the room into brief darkness. When it came back on, I froze. Evelyn hadn't moved, but something about her posture seemed different. Her head was tilted just a fraction more toward the corner, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shadow move across the wall, even though there was nothing in the room that could have cast it. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination. Night shifts mess with your mind. Everyone says that. But as I closed the door behind me and walked back down the hall, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one watching her. Back at the nurse's station, I tried to focus on the paperwork Dr. Warren had left for me. The sound of the rain against the windows was rhythmic, almost hypnotic, but it couldn't drown out the lingering unease I felt from room 17. Evelyn Mercer, her face, her stillness, the way she stared at that corner. It all felt wrong, as if I'd walked into a scene where I wasn't supposed to be. I glanced at the clock, 2:07 a.m., just a few more hours until the end of my shift. I shook my head and returned my focus to the forms in front of me. I had just started to fill out a medication log when I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound. A whisper. I froze, the pen hovering above the paper. The whisper came again, soft and distant, but I couldn't make out the words. It seemed to drift through the hallway like a breeze, but there was no wind here, no open windows. I stood up, my heart pounding. The hall was empty, bathed in the same pale fluorescent light as before. The whisper had stopped. "Hello," I called out, immediately regretting how loud my voice sounded in the silence. Nothing. I shook my head and sat back down, telling myself it was just the wind outside, or maybe a creak from the old pipes. But deep down, I didn't believe that. An hour passed, uneventful except for the occasional flicker of the lights. I tried to distract myself, flipping through patient records, but my mind kept drifting back to Evelyn. There was something about her presence that felt heavy. At 3:15 a.m., I decided to check on her again. I told myself it was just protocol, but the truth was, I needed to see her, to reassure myself that she was just a woman, not whatever my imagination was trying to make her out to be. When I reached room 17, the door was ajar. I froze. I was certain I'd closed it earlier. A chill crept over me as I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Evelyn was still in bed, sitting in the exact same position as before, her hands folded in her lap. Her head was slightly tilted, her gaze locked on the same corner. But now, the four-stand beside her had toppled over, the saline bag dangling loosely from the hook. My heart raced as I approached her. "Evelyn, are you okay?" She didn't move, didn't blink. I crouched to pick up the four-stand, setting it upright again. As I straightened, I noticed something new. The wall she had been staring at, it wasn't blank anymore. There were faint, jagged scratches across the paint, like claw marks, running from the floor to about shoulder height. I blinked, leaning closer to examine them. They weren't fresh. The edges were worn, as though they'd been there for years, but I hadn't seen them earlier. I was sure of it. My skin prickled. "Did you do this?" I whispered, even though I knew she wouldn't answer. Evelyn didn't move. I turned back toward her bed, and for the first time, she wasn't staring at the corner anymore. She was staring at me, her hollow eyes locked onto mine, and my breath caught in my throat. Her lips were slightly parted, as if she were about to speak, but no sound came out. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over the four-stand again. "Evelyn!" She blinked slowly, and then, with an almost imperceptible movement, she raised one hand. She pointed, at the corner. My chest tightened as I turned to look. The scratches on the wall seemed deeper now, darker, as if they were etched into the very foundation of the building. And then I saw it, a shadow. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the darkness pooling in the corner, but it was there. A shape that didn't belong, shifting ever so slightly. The light above flickered, and the shadow moved. My breath hitched as I stared at the shadow. It pulsed, like it was alive, moving against the corner in slow, deliberate shifts. I wanted to convince myself it was just a trick of the flickering light, but the way it moved, it wasn't random. "Who's there?" I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. Evelyn didn't answer, but her hand remained outstretched, pointing at the corner with an eerie stillness. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and I swear, in that moment, I saw the faintest glimmer of fear in her expression. The light flickered again, plunging the room into momentary darkness. My heart pounded, and when the light returned, the shadow was gone. But Evelyn was smiling. It wasn't a warm, reassuring smile. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sent a shiver down my spine. Her lips curved just enough to unsettle me, as if she knew something I didn't. I backed away toward the door, my hands trembling. I'll be right back, I said, more for myself than for her. Evelyn didn't react. She just kept staring, her smile frozen on her face. At the nurse's station, I tried to steady my breathing. The hospital's silence felt oppressive now, like it was pressing down on me from all sides. I reached for the phone to call Dr. Warren, but my hand hovered over the receiver. What would I even say? That there was a shadow in Evelyn's room? That she smiled for the first time, but it felt wrong? I dropped my hand and stared at the clipboard on the desk. Evelyn's sparse file offered no answers, no explanations for her strange behavior. I flipped through the pages again, my eyes scanning the notes. One line caught my attention, scrawled in messy handwriting at the bottom of a progress report. Patient exhibits signs of dissociation. Avoid prolonged direct engagement. Avoid prolonged direct engagement. I tapped the words with my pen, trying to make sense of them. Did they mean to avoid provoking her? Or was there something more to it? The hallway lights flickered, pulling me out of my thoughts. A low hum vibrated through the building, and for a moment, it sounded almost like a voice. A deep, guttural whisper that sent chills racing up my spine. I stood and glanced down the hallway toward room 17. The door was closed now. I was certain I'd left it open. I didn't want to go back, but I couldn't just ignore it. Swallowing my fear, I grabbed a flashlight from the station and made my way down the hall. The air grew colder with each step, and by the time I reached room 17, I could see my breath fogging in front of me. I hesitated at the door, gripping the handle tightly. "Evelyn," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. I pushed the door open, shining the flashlight inside. Evelyn was still sitting in bed, her posture unchanged. The light from the hallway illuminated her face, and I froze. Her eyes were closed now, but her smile had grown wider, stretching unnaturally across her pale face. I stepped inside, my heart hammering in my chest. "Evelyn!" The beam of the flashlight swept across the room, and that's when I saw it. The scratches on the wall had spread. They now covered the entire corner, jagged and chaotic, as if something had clawed its way out. The shadow was back, darker and more defined. But this time, it wasn't alone. Another shape loomed beside it, smaller but equally menacing, and both of them pulsed with a rhythmic motion, like they were breathing. "Evelyn!" I shouted, unable to contain my fear. Her eyes snapped open, and her head turned slowly toward me, her smile fading. For the first time, she spoke. "They're here." Her voice was raspy, barely audible, but the words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Who's here?" I whispered, taking a step back. Evelyn raised her hand again, pointing toward the corner. "They've been waiting for you." The light above us flickered violently, plunging the room into complete darkness. And then I heard it. A low, guttural growl, so close it felt like it was right in my ear. The growl reverberated through the room, low and guttural, like an animal that had crawled up from the depths of some forgotten place. My hand trembled as I tightened my grip on the flashlight, frantically clicking the button to turn it back on. Nothing. The room was suffocatingly dark, but I could feel the presence. No presences. They were close, too close. The air felt thick, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. "Evelyn," I called out, my voice shaking. A sudden burst of cold swept past me, like icy fingers brushing against my skin. My flashlight flickered weakly to life, casting a pale beam across the room. Evelyn was no longer in the bed. My heart dropped. The bed was empty, the sheets still indented where she had been sitting. I swung the flashlight frantically around the room, the beam bouncing off the cracked walls and the deep scratches etched into the corner. "Evelyn," I whispered, my voice barely audible. A soft, raspy laugh echoed behind me. I spun around, nearly dropping the flashlight. Evelyn stood by the doorway now, her thin frame casting a long, distorted shadow across the floor. Her head was tilted to the side, and her eyes glinted unnaturally in the faint light. "They've been waiting for you," she repeated, her voice hollow and distant, like it didn't belong to her. I stepped back instinctively, but my heel hit the overturned stand, sending it clattering to the floor. The noise echoed sharply in the silence, and Evelyn's smile widened unnaturally, stretching across her gaunt face. "Who's waiting?" I demanded, though my voice came out as more of a plea. She didn't answer. Instead, she raised her hand again, pointing to the corner. I didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of that room, out of that hospital, but something stronger held me in place. Against my better judgment, I turned the flashlight toward the corner. At first, I saw nothing, just the jagged scratches on the wall. But as the beam steadied, the shadows began to shift. Two figures emerged from the darkness, their forms twisting and writhing like smoke. They had no faces, only gaping voids where their features should have been, and their limbs stretched unnaturally long, their clawed hands scraping against the walls. My breath caught in my throat as one of them stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. "Claire?" it rasped, my name dragging out in a guttural, inhuman voice. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. The beam spun wildly, casting fleeting glimpses of the figures as they drew closer. Evelyn laughed again, louder this time, the sound echoing unnaturally in the small room. "They've been waiting for you for so long," she said, her voice laced with something that sounded like triumph. I scrambled for the flashlight, my fingers fumbling as the room plunged into darkness once more. The growling intensified, joined now by a chorus of whispers. Words I couldn't understand but felt deep in my bones. When I finally grasped the flashlight and turned it back on, the beam landed on Evelyn. She was right in front of me now, her face inches from mine. "Run," she whispered. Before I could react, the shadows lunged. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my chest as I felt the cold, clawing presence of the shadows behind me. The hallway was a blur as I ran, the dim lights flickering wildly overhead. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more insistent. I didn't dare look back, not even when I felt something brush against my shoulder, something cold and sharp that left a stinging sensation in its wake. The nurse's station came into view, and I dove behind the desk, gasping for air. My trembling hands reached for the phone, but when I lifted the receiver, the line was dead. "No, no, no," I muttered, slamming the receiver back down. The whispers were everywhere now, echoing through the hallway and seeping into my mind. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block them out, but it was no use. "You can't escape," the voices hissed. "You belong to us." A loud crash jolted me, and I looked up to see the shadows spilling into the hallway, their forms stretching and contorting unnaturally. Evelyn stood at the far end, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "This is where it begins," she said, her voice calm and resolute. What do you want from me? I screamed, backing further into the desk. Evelyn tilted her head again, her smile returning. It's not about what we want. It's about what you've done. Her words sent a wave of dread through me. What are you talking about? You don't remember, she said, almost pityingly. But they do. As she spoke, the shadows surged forward, and the lights in the hallway went out completely. I tried to steady my breath, the darkness pressing in on me like a heavy weight. The shadows swarmed around the hallway, their twisted forms crawling over the walls, their hands reaching out with unnatural, jerking movements. Evelyn's eerie smile was the only thing I could see in the pitch-black space, her eyes gleaming like stars in the night. You don't remember, do you? She asked, her voice low and almost affectionate, as if she was trying to console me. Remember what? I gasped, my body trembling with fear. My mind was racing, but I couldn't catch hold of anything. The shadows, those horrible, faceless things, were closing in, and the oppressive silence of the hospital only heightened the terror. They've been waiting for you, Evelyn repeated, her voice soft but insistent. All these years, they've been waiting. You brought them here. The words echoed in my mind, and for a split second, the world seemed to tilt. My head spun with confusion, and I tried to make sense of it all. I brought them here? What was she talking about? I didn't even know what I had done. I was just the night nurse at St. Augustine. I hadn't been here long enough to have any connections, nothing to explain the terror surrounding me now. I clutched the desk behind me, trying to ground myself, but my thoughts were scattered. Was this real? Was I dreaming? The shadows seemed to move closer with each breath I took. The air turned ice cold, and I felt the faintest brush of something against my arm. A finger, long and skeletal, that sent an electric jolt through my body. You have to remember. Evelyn's voice cut through the darkness again. You know what you did. You know who you are. I don't know. I screamed, panic rising in my chest. Please, just tell me what's happening. For a moment, there was silence. Then, Evelyn's figure seemed to blur in front of me, her face twisting in a way that almost seemed to shift, as if the true form beneath her fragile exterior was something far darker. She reached out her hand slowly. I flinched, but I couldn't bring myself to move. My legs felt like lead, as if the darkness was pulling me into the floor. There's no escape now, she said, her voice echoing, no longer calm, but with a sinister undertone. The hospital remembers you. It remembers everything. Suddenly, everything clicked. My heart pounded in my chest, and memories, hazy, fragmented, like pieces of a shattered mirror, came rushing back. It was years ago, before I took this job, when I had been a medical student. I had been involved in an experimental case study at a different psychiatric facility, one that was shut down abruptly after a series of strange, unexplained incidents. The details had always been kept under wraps, but something inside me now recognized the connection. The case had involved a patient named Maggie, a woman whose mental state was completely detached from reality. She would sit for hours, completely still with vacant eyes, staring at walls. But when the shadows crept around her, asterisk the same shadows asterisk, they would wisp. I had been involved in those experiments against the protocols. I had ignored the warnings about how dangerous it was, how the very walls of that place seemed to feed on the despair and pain of its inhabitants. I was too eager to make a name for myself, too driven by the desire to prove my worth. But now, standing here in St. Augustine, I realized the truth. I had unwittingly brought something into the world, something that had fed on the broken minds of the patients and the staff, growing stronger with each passing year. This hospital wasn't just a building. It was a conduit, a trap, and I had opened the door. The shadows closed in. They weren't just in the room anymore. They were everywhere, wrapping around me, suffocating me. I could hear them now, their voices thick and raspy, like the sound of dead leaves scraping across the ground. They whispered my name, pulling me further into their world. But Evelyn... No, it wasn't Evelyn anymore. Her face twisted grotesquely as she reached out for me, her fingers long and sharp, moving in unnatural jerks. "Remember," she whispered, her voice now a chorus of voices. "You brought them here. You opened the door." And then, as the shadows rushed at me, I realized with sickening clarity that they weren't here to torment me. They were here because of me, because of something I had done, something I couldn't undo. The last thing I saw before the darkness closed around me was Evelyn's face, her smile widening impossibly wide, revealing teeth far too sharp, as if she was finally complete. I don't know how much time passed. The darkness swallowed me whole, drowning out everything. My thoughts, my fear, even the bitter chill that had gripped my skin. It was as if the very air had ceased to exist, leaving me suspended in a void between worlds. There was no sound, no light, only the oppressive weight of something ancient and hungry pressing down on me. And then, just as suddenly, I was no longer in the hallway. I blinked, and the familiar, sterile walls of St. Augustine Hospital faded, replaced by a different place. An old room, filled with the scent of dust and decay. I was lying on the cold floor, and the rough texture of the stone beneath me sent a jolt of pain through my body. I scrambled to my feet, disoriented and gasping for breath. My heart thundered in my chest, and a thin layer of sweat coated my skin. The room was dimly lit by flickering candles placed in strange arrangements across the floor, casting twisted shadows that danced like the remnants of a nightmare. The air was thick with a presence that seemed to fill every inch of the room, suffocating me. The shadows on the walls moved, alive and shifting, and I could feel them watching me, waiting. I reached for the wall to steady myself, and my fingers brushed something cold and wet. Blood? I yanked my hand back, my breath quickening. I didn't want to look, but my eyes were drawn to the floor. No. The room was covered in marks, scratches, claw marks. The walls, the floor, even the ceiling. They were all adorned with them. Some were faint, barely visible, while others were deep and jagged, as if something had tried to break free over and over. And then, in the center of the room, I saw it. A large mirror stood against the far wall, its frame ornate and ancient, coated in dust and grime. But the surface wasn't a reflection. It was a doorway, a window into another world. I stepped closer, drawn to it, my heartbeat accelerating with every step. The air around the mirror seemed to shimmer, like the very fabric of reality was warping. And through it, I could see shadows, figures moving in the darkness, silent and lurking. The whispering came again, distant at first but growing louder, more insistent. "You're not supposed to be here." The voice was sharp, piercing. It echoed in my mind, reverberating through my skull. I tried to look away, but my gaze was locked on the mirror, on the figures beyond it. "They've been waiting for you." I stumbled back, my mind screaming for me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The room seemed to close in around me, the shadows stretching and twisting toward the mirror. They were pulling at me, dragging me toward that impossible doorway. And then, a figure stepped out of the darkness. It was a woman, pale and gaunt, her features twisted in pain and agony. Her eyes were wide, hollowed out, and her mouth was open in a silent scream, as though she was trapped, unable to escape. The shadows clung to her, wrapping around her like chains, as if they were feeding on her suffering. I gasped and staggered backward, my chest tight with terror. This was the place I had opened, This was the conduit, the gateway to whatever hell had been waiting in the darkness. I had brought this on everyone, on myself, on Evelyn, on the patients. I had unlocked something that had never been meant to be disturbed. The woman's eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, she seemed to see me. She reached out, her fingers twitching, her mouth moving soundlessly. But then, just as quickly, the shadows wrapped around her again, dragging her back into the mirror. And I heard the whispers once more, but this time, they were no longer just voices. They were feelings, sensations, coldness, pain, anger, an overwhelming flood of emotions, each one too much to bear. They surged into me, crashing through my mind like waves, and I saw flashes of memories, things I had long buried, the experiments, the patients, the portal. I had been part of something horrific. I had helped open the door that shouldn't have been opened, and now the price for that knowledge was being paid. I turned away from the mirror, my legs shaking beneath me, my mind racing. I had to escape, there had to be a way out, but the shadows were already closing in. They were everywhere now, filling the room, surrounding me. "Claire!" A voice called softly from behind me. I spun around to see Evelyn standing there once more. Her form was faint, like a ghost, her expression still frozen in that eerie, knowing smile. She wasn't alive, not really. She was part of this place, part of the darkness that I had helped awaken. "You opened the door," she whispered, her voice distant. "And now you have to finish it." Before I could respond, the ground beneath me shifted, and the mirror seemed to pulse, its surface rippling like water. And from within, I saw it, the thing waiting for me. It wasn't just a shadow. It wasn't just a presence. It was a creature, a being so ancient, so terrifying, that its very existence bent the laws of reality. Its eyes were endless voids, and its limbs stretched far beyond the limits of the room, reaching, grabbing. I could feel it pulling at me, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. "No," I whispered, shaking my head, backing away. "I can't." But it was too late. The darkness consumed me. I don't know how long I was trapped in the dark, but when I regained consciousness, it was as though I had been pulled from the very fabric of the world itself. My mind felt fractured, like shattered glass, and the darkness seemed to stretch on forever. There were no walls, no air, no light, only the oppressive weight of something far greater than anything I had ever known. I tried to move, but my limbs felt heavy, bound by some invisible force. The whispers were gone, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. But the feeling of being watched was palpable, an undeniable presence that seemed to crawl under my skin, suffusing every inch of my body. Then, without warning, a piercing sound shattered the silence. A scream, not mine. It came from the depths of the abyss, distant but clear, echoing through the void. It was a scream of agony, of something ancient and full of rage. My breath hitched as the scream faded, replaced by a whisper, low, cold, and malevolent. "You are not meant to be here." The words sent a chill through me, and I tried to focus, to pull myself together, but the sensations around me felt unreal, like a dream I couldn't escape. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to open my eyes. When I did, the world shifted. I was no longer in a void. I was standing in a hallway of St. Augustine, but something was wrong. The walls were cracked, covered in dark, scrawling marks that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The air was thick with the stench of rot, and the flickering lights cast long, distorted shadows that stretched and twitched like living things. And then I saw them. The patients, the lost ones, were standing in the hallway, their eyes hollow and empty, their bodies twisted by the darkness that had claimed them. They didn't move, didn't speak, but their presence was suffocating. Each one was tethered to the shadows, their forms caught between this world and whatever nightmare waited on the other side. And there, in the center of the hallway, was the mirror. It gleamed with an otherworldly light, its surface shifting, reflecting something that didn't belong. It was a portal, a doorway to whatever had been unleashed in this place. I stumbled forward, drawn to it. I could hear the whispers again, louder this time, as if they were coming from the mirror itself. "You opened it, Claire. You were the key." The shadows in the hallway seemed to lurch toward me, stretching out from the walls, clawing at the air. I turned to run, but the hallway seemed to elongate, stretching infinitely in every direction, trapping me in its grasp. "Claire," a voice called out, soft but unmistakable. I froze. It was Evelyn, but this was not the Evelyn I had known. Her form was twisted, deformed, her eyes now black voids. She wasn't just a patient anymore. She was a part of this place, this prison of shadows. "You don't have much time," she whispered, her voice distorted, like a million voices speaking at once. "It's coming for you." "Who?" I gasped, my voice shaking. Her lips parted in that same twisted smile. "It, the one you freed, the one you made." Before I could react, a shadow surged from the mirror, a tendril of darkness reaching toward me, quick as lightning. I gasped, stumbling back, but I was too slow. It wrapped around my ankle, pulling me forward, and I fell to the ground with a sickening thud. The shadows surged higher, pulling at me, tearing at my flesh, my mind, until I felt as though I were being torn apart from within. "You're part of it now," Evelyn's voice whispered, distant yet close, as though she were right beside me. "You opened the door. You belong to it." "No!" I screamed, fighting against the darkness, but my body felt like it was sinking into quicksand. The shadows were consuming me, dragging me into the mirror. And then I remembered. The portal. It had been in front of me all along. The one thing I hadn't fully realized. I wasn't just the key. I was the sacrifice. With the last ounce of my strength, I reached out, grabbing hold of the nearest object I could find. A shard of broken glass from the mirror's frame. I swung it toward the shadows, slashing through the thick tendrils wrapping around my body. The darkness recoiled, and for a split second, the hallway shifted. The mirror flickered, as if the very reality I was trapped in was starting to break apart. I didn't wait to see if it would hold. I ran toward the mirror, the shadows still clawing at me. But now, there was a sliver of light, a chance to escape. As I reached the mirror, I pushed forward, desperate to break through. But the darkness followed. I should have known better. I had opened the door. I had let it in. I had freed the very thing that had been waiting for someone to unlock the path back to this world. As I crossed the threshold of the mirror, everything went black. I had no idea what came next. No idea if I was free, or if I was now part of something far worse than I could have ever imagined. And somewhere, deep within the darkness, I felt it. It was still waiting. I couldn't tell how long I had been suspended in that black void. Time didn't exist here, and the air felt thick with suffocating dread, as though I was sinking deeper into something ancient and vast, a place where the laws of reality didn't apply. My body felt weightless, detached from the world I had known, but I could still feel it. The presence, the thing that had followed me, clawing at my very soul. The whispers had stopped. The suffocating pressure in the air had lifted, but only momentarily, before it surged back with a force so overwhelming that it crushed my chest. It was the silence that terrified me now, the way the shadows seemed to move, to breathe, as if they were alive and watching me. I tried to move, but I was frozen in place, my limbs numb and unresponsive. I reached out with my mind, trying to sense something, anything, that could guide me through the endless void. But there was nothing, and then a flicker of light. It was so faint at first that I thought I had imagined it, but as I concentrated, it grew brighter, pulsing, as if calling to me. With every pulse, I felt my body begin to move again, as though the light was drawing me toward it. My chest tightened, but I couldn't resist. Something inside me, something primal, urged me forward. I pushed myself through the darkness, each step feeling like I was walking against the weight of the universe itself. The further I went, the stronger the pull became. And then I reached it. The light expanded, revealing a shape, a figure that stood at the center of the dark expanse. It was enormous, impossibly tall, its form a swirling mass of shadows and shifting tendrils. Its face, or what passed for a face, was a blur, an endless series of distorted shapes that flickered in and out of focus, always just beyond my comprehension. But its eyes, those eyes, they locked onto me, and in that moment, I knew what it was. I knew what I had awakened. This was the entity that had been trapped in the mirror, in the shadows, waiting for someone to set it free. The thing I had brought into this world. Its voice came not through sound, but through my mind. It was a cacophony of 1,000 voices, all speaking at once, blending into a single unified consciousness. You opened the door. The words echoed in my head, reverberating through every fiber of my being. I felt as though the very essence of who I was being pulled apart, shredded by the weight of its presence. You thought you could control it, contain it, but you are nothing compared to what I am. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but my body remained frozen, my mind swirling in a haze of terror and disbelief. The light from the creature's form was blinding now, burning into my eyes, making everything else fade away until it was just me in it. You have freed me, and now you will pay the price. The darkness around it began to collapse, folding in on itself as if the very fabric of reality was being undone. I could feel it, a wave of pure malevolent force crashing toward me, threatening to engulf me whole. But then, I felt something shift inside me. It was faint, like a whisper, but it was there. No, I couldn't explain it. It wasn't a voice, it wasn't a thought. It was a feeling, a flicker of resistance, a single thread of defiance that had been buried deep within me, one that had been awakened by the very thing I had feared. It wasn't just the creature that could control this place. It wasn't just its will that shaped this reality. I had opened the door. I had brought it here, but I was still me. In that instant, I focused all my will, every last ounce of strength, and I tore myself from its grasp. The creature howled. It screamed, a primal sound that echoed through the very core of my being. But I didn't stop. I pushed harder, drawing on every scrap of knowledge I had left, every instinct buried deep within me. The truth was clear now. The portal wasn't just a doorway, it was a binding, a chain that connected both worlds. And now I had the power to close it. I reached out, my hands shaking but steady with determination. I had no idea what I was doing, but the path was clear. I had to sever the link. I had to bind the darkness back. I would have to pay the price for my mistake, but I could end it. The light pulsed again, brighter than before, and I reached for it. No, the creature's voice screamed in my mind, but I didn't waver. I slammed my hands against the darkness, forcing the light to pour into me, through me, into every corner of my soul. The power surged, raw and untamed, as I sealed the portal, locking it away. But even as the creature's howls grew distant, I felt the weight of the cost. My body began to burn, my skin searing as though it were being torn apart from the inside. I gasped for breath, but the air was thick with the stench of burning, of something foul and ancient. The shadows still clung to me, their tendrils wrapping around my chest, squeezing tighter with each passing second. And then, just when I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, I felt the pull of the world I knew. Reality snapped back into place with an overwhelming force. I awoke in the hospital again, lying on the cold tile floor of the hallway, the flickering lights above me casting a faint glow. My chest heaved with ragged breaths, and I could still feel the lingering presence of the darkness, like a shadow clinging to my skin. But the hospital was silent now. The patients were gone. The whispers were nothing but a memory. The mirror was shattered, its pieces scattered across the floor, reflecting the sterile lights in fractured shards. And in the distance, I could hear sirens, the sound of rescue, of escape. But I knew that the price had been paid. The door was closed, the darkness was bound, and I was the last one left to carry the weight of what had happened. And if you're still watching, hit the subscribe button and keep supporting the channel. Story 2. The building had been a part of Henry Palmer's life for longer than he cared to admit. In the nearly 3 decades he'd spent as the janitor, it had become as familiar to him as his own skin. He knew every creaking floorboard, every stain on the walls, every flickering light fixture, and every draft that swept through the hallways. It was a forgotten building, abandoned by most except for the occasional researcher or maintenance worker, and for Henry it was just a place to sweep, mop, and occasionally fix broken pipes. He didn't ask questions. He didn't pry into the history of the building, nor did he care about the whispers of oddities that had surrounded it for decades. People came and went, strangers with strange agendas, researchers with even stranger interests. Henry didn't mind. He had his routine, and that was enough for him. That was until one late evening when his routine was interrupted. It was a cold autumn night when Henry first noticed something strange. He had just finished cleaning the upper floors and was on his way to the janitor's closet to grab the mop bucket. The hallways were silent, the air still. It wasn't unusual. This building was always quiet after hours. The hum of the old air conditioning system was the only sound that kept him company, a soft drone that had become background noise in his life. He reached the janitor's closet, a small room tucked at the far end of the hallway, hidden behind a heavy door that was rarely opened. As he grabbed the bucket, his eyes wandered over the assortment of cleaning supplies stacked on the shelves. Sponges, rags, industrial cleaners, and then something caught his attention. A small, tarnished key sat on the edge of one of the shelves, nearly hidden beneath a pile of dust and old rags. It wasn't like the keys he was used to. It wasn't for any of the doors in the building. It was older, its edges worn smooth by time, and it had a strange symbol etched into the surface. A pattern that resembled a spiral, but distorted, as if it had been carved hastily by someone who had no idea what they were doing. Henry reached for it, his fingers brushing the cool metal. He didn't know why, but the key felt important, as though it had been waiting for him to find it. He picked it up carefully, inspecting it in the dim light of the closet. Where had it come from? The next morning, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The key remained in his pocket, an odd weight that seemed to tug at him, urging him to do something with it. He spent the day cleaning as usual, trying to ignore the nagging thought in the back of his mind that something was calling him. Something deeper within the building. By evening, when the last of the researchers had left and the building was quiet again, Henry decided to investigate. He knew every corner of this place, but he had never ventured into the deepest parts. There were rooms, locked doors, hallways that seemed to lead nowhere. Places the building's former occupants had sealed off years ago, long before Henry had ever started working here. But tonight, he felt something was pulling him toward those hidden spaces. The door at the end of the hallway, the one that had always been locked, was now slightly ajar. Henry's breath caught in his throat. He was certain this door had never been opened before. He had cleaned the hallway for years, and he had never once seen the door shift even a fraction of an inch. Yet here it was, hanging half open, the air behind it thick with the smell of dust and something else. Something old. His hand trembled as he pulled the key from his pocket and walked toward the door. He hesitated for a moment, but something about the strange, magnetic pull of the building urged him on. Slowly, he inserted the key into the lock. To his surprise, it turned with a soft click, the mechanism giving way as if the door had been waiting for him. The room behind it was shrouded in darkness. Henry flicked the light switch, but the bulb sputtered and died, leaving him with nothing but the dim glow from the hallway. The room was a mess. Papers scattered across the floor, old furniture covered in sheets, and a thick layer of dust settled over everything like a forgotten memory. But it wasn't the state of the room that caught his attention. It was the symbol. On the far wall, etched deeply into the plaster, was the same spiral pattern as on the key. It was crude but unmistakable. The more Henry stared at it, the more it seemed to move, as if it were alive, its edges shifting in the low light. Henry stepped closer, drawn to it. He ran his hand over the markings. The texture was uneven, as if the wall had been gouged out by something inhuman. But there was something else. A soft glow coming from beneath the surface, faint but unmistakable. Suddenly, the air around him grew colder. His breath turned to mist in front of his face, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. And then he heard it. A sound, soft at first, but growing louder, as if something was stirring beneath the floorboards. A faint scratching, like claws on wood, but more insistent, more deliberate. Henry's heart raced. He looked around, suddenly aware of how isolated he was. No one else was in the building. No one would hear him if something went wrong. The sound stopped, leaving behind an eerie silence. Henry's hand hovered over the symbol on the wall, his mind racing. He needed to know what this was, what he had stumbled upon. But as his fingers brushed against the wall again, the symbol flared to life. The symbol on the wall seemed to pulse beneath Henry's fingertips, as though it were alive. His breath caught in his throat, the air around him thickening with a palpable sense of something awakening, something ancient and insistent, clawing its way through the walls. For a moment, Henry hesitated, wondering if he had made a mistake. But his curiosity, the insatiable need to uncover the secrets of the building, drove him forward. He pressed harder against the symbol, as if willing it to reveal its truth. The moment his fingers made contact, a low rumble shook the floor beneath him, the sound vibrating through the room like a far-off thunderstorm. The walls groaned, the floorboards creaked, and then the symbol flared with a bright, blinding light. Henry stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. The light was unbearable, searing his vision, making his skin crawl with a coldness that seeped into his bones. He raised his hands instinctively to shield his eyes, but the light pressed in on him, filling every corner of the room. The floor beneath him seemed to shift, as if the very foundations of the building were twisting. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished. Henry blinked rapidly, trying to adjust his vision, and when the haze cleared, he found himself standing in a completely different room, one he hadn't seen before. This room was vast, the walls stretching high above him, lost in shadow. The air was thick with the smell of damp stone, and the faint echo of dripping water reached his ears. The ground was uneven, jagged, as if it had been carved into the earth itself. He turned around, but the door he had entered through was gone. The hallway, the closet, the building as he had known it, all of it had vanished. It was as if he had been swallowed by the very building itself, a part of something older, more sinister than he could ever comprehend. A low, guttural sound filled the room, reverberating off the stone walls. Henry froze, his pulse racing. His eyes darted around, searching for the source of the noise. Out of the corner of his eye, something moved. A shadow, long and twisted, slithering across the floor, barely visible in the dim light. Henry instinctively backed away, his heart hammering in his chest. He had no idea what was happening, but one thing was clear. Whatever was here, whatever had been unleashed, was not something he was prepared to face. The shadow shifted again, and then, from the darkness, something stepped forward, something that could not have been human. It was tall, its skin an unnatural shade of gray, its face a warped, grotesque mask, its eyes wide, hollow, and black as coal, fixed on Henry with an intensity that made him feel like prey. Its mouth twisted into a grin, its teeth sharp and jagged, like broken glass. It spoke, its voice a low, rasping whisper that seemed to echo directly in Henry's mind. "You shouldn't have come here, janitor." Henry's throat tightened. He wanted to scream, to run, but his legs refused to move. The figure in front of him was not just a physical presence. It was an embodiment of fear, of darkness itself. It was the thing that had been waiting in the shadows of the building for decades, perhaps even centuries. "You're too late," it continued, its voice dripping with malice. "This place was never meant to be discovered. You've opened the door. Now it will open you." Henry's mind raced. He had no idea what it meant, but the meaning was clear enough. He had triggered something by finding the key, by unlocking the symbol. But why him? Why had the building chosen him? His thoughts spiraled, but there was no time for answers. The creature took a step forward, its footfalls heavy, each one echoing like a death knell. He had to act, but what could he do? He was just a janitor, a man who cleaned floors and fixed broken pipes. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't prepared for this. But then he remembered the key. He reached into his pocket, his fingers trembling, and pulled it out. The metal felt impossibly cold against his skin. The key seemed to hum with an energy of its own, pulsing as if it were alive. The creature's eyes locked onto the key in his hand, and for a moment, there was something almost wary in its expression. It stopped moving, its grin faltering as it took a step back. "No," the creature whispered, its voice thick with disbelief. "That key, it can't be." But before it could finish its thought, Henry's instincts took over. He raised the key above his head, and as if on cue, a brilliant flash of light erupted from it, brighter than anything he had ever seen. The light wasn't blinding. It was all-encompassing, wrapping around the room, consuming everything in its path. The creature screeched, a sound so high-pitched that Henry's ears bled, but he couldn't stop. The light grew stronger, more intense, until it was blinding. He held the key tightly, his grip unshakable as the very foundation of the building began to tremble around him. And then, with a final, deafening roar, the creature disintegrated into nothingness, vanishing into the light. Henry collapsed to the floor, the key slipping from his hand. The world around him seemed to return to normal, the eerie shadows receding, the oppressive air lightening. His breathing was shallow, ragged, his mind reeling from what had just occurred. He didn't know how long he stayed there, on the cold stone floor, the building's silence overwhelming him. When he finally stood, the room was no longer vast and oppressive. It had returned to its former state, just another hidden room in the forgotten building. But something had changed. The building was no longer just a structure. It was alive, aware of his presence. And the key that had started it all, was gone. Henry returned to the building, to his janitor's closet, where everything had started. But the feeling of unease, of being watched, never left him. He had closed one door, but the building held many more secrets. Secrets that would never truly be forgotten, and keys that might still be waiting to unlock them. As he began his duties once again, sweeping the same floors and cleaning the same hallways, he knew one thing for sure: the building had not finished with him yet. The days that followed Henry's encounter in the hidden room were strange. The building, though outwardly unchanged, felt different to him now. Every creak of the floorboards, every draft that fluttered through the hallways, seemed to carry a sense of awareness, as if the very structure was alive, watching him. The oppressive silence that had once comforted him now felt stifling, suffocating. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer alone within its walls. At first, he told himself it was just his imagination, spooked by the bizarre events of the night, shaken by the glimpse of something he couldn't fully comprehend. But as the days passed, that unease grew, gnawing at him like a persistent itch that he couldn't scratch. The building wasn't the same, and neither was he. One evening, several weeks later, as Henry mopped the floors in one of the older hallways near the basement, he noticed something different. There was a faint sound, a scraping, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Henry paused, listening intently. The scraping sound was coming from behind a door at the far end of the corridor. The door was old, heavy, and coated with dust, its paint peeling in places. It was one of those rooms he had always avoided, the ones the staff rarely used, its purpose lost to time. But tonight, the sound was different. It was unmistakable now. Something or someone was on the other side of the door. Henry hesitated. His hand was already on the mop, but his legs felt like they were rooted to the floor. The scraping continued, persistent and unsettling. It wasn't just the sound that unnerved him. It was the sensation that the room, the building itself, was waiting for him to open the door, as if it had been planning this moment for a long time. He moved toward the door, his heart pounding. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around and leave, but the key, the mystery, the weight of his role in this strange, haunted place all pushed him forward. As his hand touched the cold, brass doorknob, the scraping stopped. The silence returned, but it was a heavier silence now, one that pressed down on his chest and made it harder to breathe. Taking a deep breath, Henry turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow, dimly lit room. The air inside was musty, filled with the scent of old paper and mildew. On the far wall, a stack of boxes sat haphazardly piled, the contents hidden beneath layers of dust and cobwebs. But it wasn't the boxes that caught Henry's attention. It was the mirror. A large, ornate mirror stood against the wall, its frame carved with intricate patterns. But it was no ordinary mirror. There was something wrong with it. Its surface shimmered, rippling like water, as if it were alive. The reflection in the mirror wasn't his own. For a moment, Henry stood frozen in place, his breath catching in his throat. The figure in the mirror wasn't him. It was a man he had never seen before. His face was pale, gaunt, his eyes wide with fear. His lips were parted, as if trying to say something, but no sound came out. The figure in the mirror moved, its head tilting to one side, as if acknowledging Henry's presence. And then it smiled. Henry stepped back, his heart racing. He spun around, but there was no one behind him. The room was empty. The sound of his pulse thudded in his ears, drowning out everything else. He turned back to the mirror, and the figure was still there, its grin widening, its eyes now fixed on him with an unsettling intensity. Before he could move, A voice filled the room, low, gravelly, but unmistakable. "You're not supposed to be here." Henry's legs trembled. The voice came from the figure in the mirror, but it was not just its voice, it was his voice. The words seemed to vibrate in his skull, resonating deep inside him, a feeling of dread pooling in his stomach. He reached out, unsure of what he was doing, and touched the glass. The moment his fingers made contact, the surface of the mirror rippled, like a drop of water falling into a pond. Suddenly, everything around him distorted. The room blurred, the air seemed to thicken, and the walls began to bend and warp. The reflection in the mirror stretched, elongating, its edges twisting into impossible shapes. And then, just as quickly, the mirror went still. Henry jerked his hand back, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. He didn't know what had just happened, but he knew one thing. Whatever that was, whatever he had just witnessed, it was tied to the building. The building that had changed him. The building that had begun to feel like it was alive. The next day, Henry couldn't stop thinking about the mirror, about the figure trapped within it. His thoughts swirled, confused and full of dread. What was it trying to tell him? Why did it look like him? And why was it warning him? He found himself searching the building's old records, long-forgotten blueprints, and obscure notes that had been left behind by previous caretakers. It took him days to uncover anything useful. Most of the records were in disarray, half of them illegible, but he eventually stumbled upon a document that seemed relevant. It was an old journal entry, written in the handwriting of someone who had worked here many years ago. The entry described the mirror as a portal, an object created to trap something within the building, something that was never meant to escape. The journal warned that anyone who interacted with the mirror would be marked, cursed to forever see themselves trapped in the reflection, unable to leave. Henry's heart sank as he read further. The journal spoke of a terrible event that had taken place in the building's past. An accident, an experiment gone wrong, and the creation of the mirror was the result of that failure. Whoever had created it had tried to lock away something dangerous, something they had unleashed in their pursuit of knowledge. And now it seemed that whatever had been trapped in that mirror was reaching out. The deeper Henry dug, the more he uncovered. He learned about the people who had worked in the building before him. Researchers, scientists, and caretakers, all of whom had vanished under mysterious circumstances. Each disappearance had been followed by strange events, rumors of shadows in the halls, whispers of things that didn't belong in this world. But what horrified him most was what he found in the final pages of the journal. The truth about the building's original architect. He was not a man of science, but something far darker, a practitioner of forbidden knowledge, someone who believed in manipulating the fabric of reality itself. Henry learned that the building was never meant to house research or experimentation. It was a prison, a containment facility designed to hold something ancient, something powerful and malevolent. The key, the mirror, the building, all of them were linked to that dark past. And now Henry had become a part of it. The more Henry learned, the more he realized that there was no escaping the building. The key he had found, the mirror he had encountered, everything was part of a much larger, more dangerous puzzle, one that had no easy solution. The creature he had locked away, the thing that had tormented him in the dark room, it wasn't gone. It had only been temporarily sealed, and now it was stronger than ever. And worse yet, Henry had no choice but to continue cleaning the building, maintaining the very place that was both his prison and his curse. The spiral had begun. As the days bled into one another, Henry's life became a blur, a cyclical routine of sweeping and mopping, but all with a growing sense of dread gnawing at him. He still couldn't shake the haunting image of the figure in the mirror, its twisted grin and hollow eyes. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the figure wasn't just some supernatural reflection. It was a warning, a messenger from whatever malevolent force lurked in the depths of the building. He had tried to convince himself that it was all in his head, the stress of working alone in the vast, empty building, the isolation beginning to erode his mind. But the more he uncovered, the more undeniable the truth became. The building itself was alive, and it wasn't done with him yet. One night, after finishing his usual rounds, Henry made a decision. He couldn't keep pretending that he was simply a janitor, that he could clean the floors and ignore what had happened. There was too much at stake now. The key, the mirror, the twisted reflections. It all led back to the same question. What was the building hiding? He stood at the entrance of the basement stairwell, looking down into the darkness below. The building's foundations seemed to stretch far deeper than he had ever realized. He had been told to never go into the basement alone, that it was too dangerous, too unstable. But tonight, Henry couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to know. With his heart pounding in his chest, he descended into the bowels of the building. The basement was cold, the air damp and musty, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the upper floors. Henry fumbled for a flashlight in his pocket, his hands shaking. He wasn't sure what he was expecting to find. Some hidden room, some secret door, but he had to search. The building had shown him so much, and he couldn't back away now. As he walked deeper into the basement, the narrow hallways twisted like a maze. The walls were lined with old pipes and rusting machinery, most of it long abandoned. He passed old crates and forgotten supplies, their contents lost to time. The air seemed to grow heavier with each step, and the low hum of the building's systems filled the space, amplifying the sense of isolation. He reached a large metal door at the end of the hallway. The hinges rusted, the paint chipped and peeling. There was no sign of a lock, no handle, only a large circular slot in the middle of the door. Henry approached it cautiously. It was as if the door had been waiting for him, calling him, urging him to open it. The key that had started all of this, the one that had led him to the hidden room with the symbol and the mirror, seemed to call to him from his pocket. It felt heavier now, as if it were pulsating with energy, with power. He reached for the key and placed it into the slot. There was a low grinding noise, and the door creaked open, revealing a dark chamber beyond. The air that spilled out was thick with dust and something darker, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He stepped inside. The room was enormous, stretching farther than he could see, its walls hidden in darkness. A single overhead light flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the room. The floor was covered in layers of old paper, books, and notes, some yellowed with age, others freshly stained with ink and dried blood. It was like an archive of the building's forgotten past, its dark history. The walls were covered in sketches, diagrams, and symbols, all connected in a web of disturbing complexity. And in the center of the room, standing on a raised platform, was an object, an ancient device that looked as though it had been pulled straight from a nightmare. It was a large, twisted altar of sorts, made from stone and metal, its surface etched with the same spiraling symbol that had marked the key. Around it were candles, long since burned down to stubs, and remnants of what appeared to be a ritual. An old, forgotten ritual that had been abandoned long ago. The air felt wrong, suffused with a malignant energy that seemed to press against Henry's chest. And then he saw it. At the far end of the room, chained to the wall, was a figure, a man or what was left of one. His body was thin and gaunt, his face pale and covered in grime. His eyes, however, were wide open, and they locked onto Henry's with an intensity that made him freeze in place. The man's mouth was moving, but no sound came out. He was trying to say something, but the words were lost, trapped in the emptiness of the room. Henry's heart raced. He knew, without a doubt, that this man had something to do with everything. The key, the mirror, the building itself. This was no ordinary prisoner. This was the architect, the one who had created this place, the one who had unleashed whatever force now controlled it. The man's eyes widened even further, and Henry felt the distinct sense that he was being warned again, this time in a way that was impossible to ignore. The figure's mouth moved once more, his words slow and deliberate. "You should have stayed away." Henry's hand went instinctively to the key in his pocket, and as soon as his fingers brushed the cool metal, the room seemed to shift. The walls warped, the air thickened, and the ground beneath him trembled. The figure's voice grew louder, his words more frantic. "It has always been here. It never leaves. It takes everything." The candles around the altar flared to life, their flames casting flickering shadows against the walls. The spiral symbol on the altar began to glow, its lines curling and twisting like they were alive, and Henry felt a surge of terror unlike anything he had ever known. He looked back at the man, his eyes filled with panic. It was as if the figure was pleading with him, warning him that whatever had been unleashed here could not be stopped, that Henry had already become a part of it. But it was too late. The building shifted again. Henry stumbled back as the walls of the room twisted into darkness, the air growing colder. The once silent building now seemed to groan and creak, its very foundations shaking with an unnatural force. The figure in the corner screamed in silent agony, his body writhing as if pulled by invisible chains. Henry turned, but before he could escape, the doors to the room slammed shut with an ear-shattering bang. The key pulsed in his hand once again, as though it were alive. Henry's breath came in ragged gasps as the door slammed shut behind him. The room pulsed with energy, as if the building itself was coming to life around him. The darkness seemed to close in, swallowing the light, the walls stretching and contracting in a grotesque rhythm. The figure chained to the wall was still screaming in silence, his body contorted in unimaginable ways, as though the very fabric of his being was being torn apart. The key in Henry's hand was vibrating, its edges glowing faintly, as if it had become an extension of his very pulse. He could feel its power, ancient and malevolent, coursing through him. The building had drawn him in, and now it was showing him the true nature of the nightmare he had unknowingly stepped into. It had always been here, never leaves, takes everything. The words echoed in his mind, but they were no longer just words. They were a prophecy, a warning. Henry's heart hammered in his chest as he tried to understand what was happening. What was this place? What was the figure warning him about? What was the entity that had been imprisoned here? With trembling hands, Henry gripped the key tighter. It seemed to resonate with the altar at the center of the room. The symbol on the altar, the same one that had been carved into the key, began to glow brighter, its spiraling lines shifting, twisting, as if they were trying to tell him something. Henry's thoughts raced. He had to make sense of this before it was too late. The building was changing, becoming something else, something darker. He stepped closer to the altar, his eyes fixated on the symbol. The closer he got, the more the air seemed to thicken. It wasn't just the physical space that felt altered. It was the very fabric of reality itself. The atmosphere in the room became oppressive, heavy with a presence that he could feel pressing against his skin. The chains rattled as the figure on the wall struggled more violently, his eyes now wide with terror. Henry tried to move toward him, but his feet felt like they were rooted to the ground, the weight of the building's energy holding him in place. "You cannot escape." The voice came not from the figure, but from within the walls themselves. It was low, guttural, as if the building itself was speaking, no growling. its words reverberating through Henry's very bones. He could feel the voice inside his mind, coiling around his thoughts, sinking into his consciousness like a poisonous vine. Henry staggered backward, his eyes darting around the room. His mind raced with questions, but the answers came slowly, like a slow drip of water in a cavernous, pitch-black cave. The figure, the entity, it was all connected to the key to the building. Whatever had been locked away here, whatever had been sealed by those before him, was now awakening. And it was using him. The key had chosen him. It had drawn him into the web that had been spun long ago. But why? What was he meant to do? Why was he the one who had found it? The thought filled him with a growing sense of dread. He wasn't just trapped by the building. He was linked to it, bound to it in a way that he couldn't escape. The figure on the wall suddenly went still, his body slack, as if drained of all life. Henry's heart skipped a beat, and he turned to the altar, where the symbol was now pulsating with a rhythmic energy. The air around him began to hum, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through his chest, rattling his bones. The walls seemed to bend and warp even more, the very reality of the room distorting. A low voice, barely a whisper, drifted into his ear. "You have come too late." It was a voice unlike any Henry had ever heard, cold, ancient, filled with an unfathomable malice. The voice of the entity that had been locked away for so long. In that instant, Henry knew the truth. The key, the mirror, the building, they were all part of a ritual, a twisted, forbidden experiment designed to trap something much older, much darker than anything he had imagined. The entity that had once been contained here had not been defeated. It had been merely restrained, bound by the very architecture of the building. The key was not just a physical object. It was the final link, the last piece of the puzzle that could unleash the full power of whatever had been imprisoned here. And now, Henry had become part of the chain. The altar's glow intensified, and the ground beneath Henry's feet began to tremble. The chains that held the figure to the wall rattled again, but this time they didn't stop. The man's eyes shot open, and this time, he didn't just scream in silence. He screamed for real. Henry tried to move, but the energy in the room held him in place. It was like the building itself was feeding on him, draining him of strength, making him weaker with every passing second. No, you have to stop. It's not too late. You can still leave." The figure's words came out in a frantic, desperate plea, but Henry couldn't answer. His mouth felt dry, and his limbs were numb, as if the very air around him had solidified into stone. He stumbled backward, desperately trying to break free, but it was as if the building itself was closing in on him, its walls warping and shifting around him. The dark energy in the room was growing stronger, its influence over him tightening with every breath. The key in his hand pulsed again, sending a shock of cold through his body. The figure on the wall let out a final, agonized scream, and Henry's vision began to blur. The altar's light flashed, bright and blinding, and everything around him seemed to explode into a burst of light and sound. When Henry awoke, he was no longer in the room. The walls of the basement were gone. The building itself felt distant, muted. He couldn't tell where he was, but it didn't matter. The key was still in his hand, and it was cold to the touch. The symbol on the altar, the figure, everything, it was all gone. The air around him was still, quiet, but he knew it wasn't over. The entity hadn't been released. It had only been waiting, dormant, biding its time. And now, Henry was no longer just a part of the building. He was the key. The silence that followed was deafening. Henry sat on the cold, damp floor, staring at the key still gripped in his hand. It felt different now, heavier, more significant, as if it had changed along with him, or perhaps as if he had changed along with it. His thoughts were scattered, his mind struggling to process what had just transpired. The air around him was stale, but it carried the faintest hum, a low, persistent vibration that seemed to pulse from deep within the building's foundations. He staggered to his feet, his body aching as if he'd been asleep for ages. The basement was gone, but the echo of its presence lingered. Henry couldn't quite comprehend it. How had he escaped? What had happened to the entity, to the man chained to the wall, to the ritual that had led him here? Was it over, or had he simply been swept into another phase of the nightmare? The key in his hand throbbed again, a shock of cold running through his veins. He gripped it tighter, feeling its unnatural pulse reverberating through him. There was no going back now. Whatever the building had been hiding, whatever dark force it had kept sealed, Henry was now bound to it. He had become part of the cycle. The question was, what now? His eyes scanned the darkened room, or what he thought was a room. It was difficult to tell. Everything around him felt like a shifting, distorting dream. The walls seemed to sway as if they were breathing, the corners of the space growing darker with every passing second. There was no escape from this place, not really. The building had claimed him, and with the key now fused to him, he understood that there was no exit. Not for him, not for anyone. He tried to move, to leave, but the floor beneath him seemed to give way, as if the very ground was alive and pulling him deeper into its bowels. His heart pounded in his chest. His body was no longer his own. It moved as if controlled by some unseen force. The key in his hand burned, its cold, steady pulse guiding his every step. Henry understood then. The building wasn't just a structure. It was a living entity, a vessel of unimaginable darkness. The ritual had been designed to trap it, to contain it within these walls, but the ritual had been imperfect. It had been weakened over time, and the key had been the last piece. It had found him, and now Henry was its anchor. It was no longer about survival. It was about maintaining the balance, keeping the building and its malevolent force contained. If he failed, if he let go, the entity would break free, and the world would be consumed. The light flickered and dimmed as Henry's thoughts turned darker. The air thickened around him, and the hum grew louder. He realized, with growing dread, that it was too late to turn back. He had become part of the building. He was part of its curse now. His soul, his existence, was bound to it, and it was only a matter of time before the entity would attempt to break free. The walls began to close in, the darkness becoming suffocating. Henry's breath quickened as the space around him tightened, pushing in on him from all sides. The symbol that had once glowed so brightly on the altar began to reappear, this time burning into the walls, glowing with an intensity that burned Henry's eyes. "You cannot escape." The voice, that low, terrible growl, came again. This time it wasn't just in his mind. It filled the very air around him, vibrating his bones. The ground beneath him rumbled as if the entire building was shaking with an immense, terrible force. Henry staggered back, his heart racing, as the walls twisted and morphed, becoming something else entirely. They were no longer the walls of the basement. They were the boundaries of the entity's prison. And the prison was cracking. With a final, chilling scream, the building seemed to tear apart, the floor splitting open, swallowing the last remnants of the dark ritual. The key, still clutched in Henry's hand, blazed with an unbearable light. He could feel it, feel its power surging through him, but it was more than he could handle. It was too much, too overwhelming. In the distance, beyond the walls, beyond the prison, he could hear the sound of something awakening. It wasn't just the building that was alive. The entity was waking too. As the light grew brighter, Henry felt his consciousness slipping. His vision blurred, the edges of reality fraying around him. He tried to fight it, to hold on to himself, but it was useless. The key was no longer just an object. It had consumed him, bound his soul to the building forever. And now there was no way out. The last thing Henry saw before everything went black was the face of the figure who had once warned him. He saw the same pleading expression, the same silent scream, but this time the man was no longer a prisoner. He was free, but so was the entity. The building had won. The janitor's key, now lost in the shifting darkness of the building, remained as it always had, its cold, silent pulse echoing through the empty halls. Story 3. The train was late, and for Caroline, that was the least of her worries. She stood on the empty platform, the wind tugging at her jacket, the quiet hum of distant trains filling the cool evening air. The station was old, decades of history were etched into its walls, the faded signs, the rusted railings. She had visited this place once as a child, a memory that now felt like a dream. But now, as an adult, the station felt unfamiliar, almost wrong. The air was too still, too thick with something unnameable. Caroline glanced at her watch. 10:15 p.m. The train was scheduled to arrive at 10 o'clock. She had already been waiting for 20 minutes. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a reminder of the world she had been trying to escape. She pulled it out, half expecting a message from her boss, reminding her of another looming deadline. But instead, it was a text from an unknown number. "You shouldn't be here. Leave now. It's too late." She frowned, heart skipping a beat. It was odd, unsettling. No one knew where she was, let alone would send a cryptic warning. She didn't reply. The thought of leaving crossed her mind briefly, but she was tired, too tired to go anywhere else. She had made her decision. She was going to board the last train and head home, even if it was the last ride of her life. She stuffed the phone back into her pocket and took a deep breath. The station was becoming quieter by the minute. The lights flickered, casting long shadows across the platform. She looked around, but she was still alone. The other passengers, if there were any, had long since left. Just then, the sound of an approaching train broke the silence. Caroline's heart leaped. She peered down the tracks, the train's headlights cutting through the darkness. The train was an old one, heavy, black, and gleaming under the moonlight. It screeched to a halt in front of her, and the doors slid open with an eerie hiss. The conductor, a thin, gray-haired man in a uniform that seemed a little too old-fashioned, stepped out. He looked at her with tired eyes and nodded toward the open door. "Evening, miss. Hop on," he said in a gravelly voice. Caroline hesitated for a moment. There was something about his face, something unfamiliar about his presence, but the fatigue in her body urged her forward. She needed to sit, to rest. The train was her only escape from the world. She stepped inside, her boots clicking against the metal floor. The interior was dimly lit, and the seats were old, worn but well kept. There were no other passengers. The train was eerily empty, save for the conductor, who had already disappeared into the back cabin. Caroline walked further down the aisle, choosing a seat by the window. She gazed out at the station as the train slowly began to pull away, the lights of the platform fading into the distance. The train was moving faster now, the hum of the engine filling the air. Caroline leaned back in her seat, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that had taken root in her chest. The train was oddly silent, no clattering of wheels on the tracks, no sound of movement from other passengers. It was as if the whole world had been muted, leaving her alone in this strange, isolated space. She glanced at her watch again. 10:45 p.m. She should have been on her way home by now, but the train was moving slower than expected, and there was no sign of the usual bustle of passengers. It was strange how little the conductor had spoken, and even stranger that no one else had gotten on. Suddenly, a cold draft swept through the cabin, chilling her skin. Caroline shivered and looked around. The train was as empty as it had been when she boarded, but now the atmosphere felt different, thicker, heavier, as though something was watching her. Her phone buzzed again. This time, she didn't hesitate. She pulled it from her pocket, her fingers trembling. The same number. "You don't belong here. The train is taking you somewhere else. It's already too late." Caroline felt a chill run down her spine. She scrolled back through the conversation, trying to understand what was happening. There was no name, no indication of who the message was from. Only an ominous warning. She looked up from her phone, eyes scanning the dark train. In the distance, she saw a faint shadow moving in the aisle. Someone was coming. The figure grew closer, its outline still faint in the dim light. As it neared, Caroline could see the pale face of a woman, her features sharp and delicate, her hair pinned up in an old-fashioned style. She was dressed in an elegant but outdated dress, a long, dark green gown with lace trim. Caroline's breath caught in her throat. There was something wrong about the woman's appearance. Her skin was pale, unnaturally so, and her eyes were hollow, as if she hadn't blinked in years. Her lips were thin, drawn into a tight, strained smile. The woman stopped in front of Caroline's seat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, pressing on Caroline's chest. Finally, the woman spoke, her voice soft but clear, like a melody from another time. "Are you traveling alone, dear?" she asked. Caroline swallowed, unsure of how to respond. There was something almost too polite about the woman, something that seemed to put her on edge. "Yes, I am," she replied, her voice shaky. "Where is this train headed?" The woman smiled wider, her eyes never leaving Caroline's face. "This train, it's taking you to a place you may not wish to go," the woman said cryptically. "But it's not up to you anymore. You are already bound to it." Before Caroline could respond, the woman turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the train. Her footsteps faded, echoing down the empty aisle until they, too, vanished. Caroline sat there, staring at the space where the woman had been, her pulse quickening. The words echoed in her mind. Bound to it. Was it a warning, or was something more sinister unfolding? The air grew colder as the train sped through the night, the landscape outside now just a blur of darkness. Caroline's breath fogged up the window as she stared out, her mind racing with questions. Who was that woman? And what did she mean by bound to it? The message on her phone buzzed again, more urgent this time. "They're coming. You're not alone. Don't let them take you." Caroline's heart pounded in her chest. She looked around again. The cabin was still empty, no sign of anyone else. Just her, the empty seats, and the strange, heavy silence. But she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was waiting, watching. Suddenly, she heard footsteps again. This time, the sound of multiple pairs. A group of figures appeared at the far end of the cabin, emerging from the darkness. They walked slowly toward her, their faces obscured by shadow. As they drew closer, Caroline could make out their features. Pale faces, dark eyes that seemed too large, too blank, staring straight ahead as if in a trance. They wore clothes from another era, the men in suits and the women in old-fashioned dresses, as though they were actors from a bygone film. They didn't speak. They didn't even acknowledge her presence. They simply walked past her, one by one, their footsteps steady but unnerving. When the last of them passed, Caroline finally found her voice. "Who are you?" she called out, but no one responded. One of the men, a tall figure with gaunt features, stopped as if hearing her for the first time. He turned slowly, his face expressionless. "We are passengers, just like you," he said in a hollow, distant tone. His words chilled Caroline to the bone. She wanted to ask more, but the man turned away and continued down the aisle, vanishing into the shadows. The train slowed. Caroline glanced at her watch, 11:50 p.m. She had no idea how much time had passed since the last group of passengers had appeared. Her sense of time was becoming distorted, and the quiet hum of the train was beginning to make her feel as though she were trapped in some strange, timeless place. The train came to a complete stop, its brakes screeching as if the wheels were being dragged through metal. The lights flickered and dimmed. Caroline's breath caught. The doors at the far end of the cabin slid open. A new figure stood in the doorway, a tall man dressed in a dark, elegant suit, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. He stepped inside the cabin, his presence commanding the air. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though every step was measured. The last passenger, Caroline, stood, frozen in place, unable to take her eyes off him as he walked toward her. His hat shadowed most of his face, but she could see his lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "You've made it," he said softly, his voice like a distant whisper in the dark. Caroline opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The man took a seat across from her, his smile never fading. "You're not going to make it out of here, you know?" he continued, his voice calm and soothing. "Not unless you understand what you're truly running from." Caroline's heart raced. She was terrified, but something about this man, this last passenger, felt different. He was familiar, but she couldn't place him. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes gleaming with some dark knowledge. "You should have left when you had the chance," he whispered. "Now you're trapped, just like the rest of us." The man across from Caroline didn't say another word, but his eyes, those cold, knowing eyes, never left hers. He sat back in his seat, the silence stretching between them like an invisible force, pressing down on Caroline's chest. The train had stopped moving entirely, and the air in the cabin had grown oppressively thick. She looked out the window again, hoping to see something that might give her a sense of where they were, anything to anchor her. But all she could see was darkness, a void that stretched on endlessly. The station she had left behind, the world she thought she knew, was gone. It was as if the train itself had peeled away from reality and was drifting in some other dimension. The landscape outside had become a blackened blur, as if it had been erased from existence. "Where are we?" Caroline whispered, her voice barely a breath. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the question hang in the air, as though savoring the fear it stirred. Finally, after a long, deliberate pause, he spoke, his voice soft and smooth, like velvet. "We are nowhere," he said. "We are in the space between places. The train doesn't take you to where you think you're going. It takes you to where you need to go. And right now, you need to face the truth of what you've become." Caroline's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't understand what he meant. What had she become? She wasn't like these other passengers. Her life wasn't supposed to be like theirs. But something inside her felt the truth in his words, like a cold hand pressing against her soul. Her instincts told her that the answer was out there, waiting for her, but she was terrified of what she might find. Before she could ask another question, a loud clank echoed through the train, followed by a deep, rumbling vibration beneath her feet. The lights flickered, and a series of muffled, eerie whispers filled the air, as if the walls themselves were alive, breathing. The train jerked forward suddenly, its engine roaring back to life. Caroline's seatbelt tightened around her waist as the train picked up speed. The walls of the cabin seemed to pulse with a strange energy, and the temperature dropped even further, making her teeth chatter. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man leaned forward again, his eyes locking with hers. This time, his smile was gone. His expression was one of sorrow, as though he knew something terrible was about to unfold. "To the end of your journey," he replied quietly. "To the place where you'll understand what it means to be the final passenger." Caroline's stomach churned. She could feel the weight of his words sinking in, a deep sense of dread filling her chest. The last passenger? Was she the one meant to stay on this train forever? The train's speed increased. She could hear the sound of the wheels screeching against the tracks, louder than before. She looked out the window again, and this time, she saw something. A faint glow, like distant lights, appeared on the horizon. It was a station, she realized, a station that loomed out of the dark like a forgotten monument to the past. And in that moment, Caroline knew that she would never leave this train. She had crossed some invisible line, some barrier that had closed the door behind her forever. As the train approached the station, the lights grew brighter, more intense. She could see figures standing on the platform, their silhouettes faint and ghostly in the distance. They were waiting for her just like the others, the last passengers. She felt an overwhelming urge to look away, but she couldn't. She couldn't turn back now. The train slowed as it reached the station, its brakes screeching in protest. Caroline's heart thudded in her chest as the doors hissed open, revealing the platform. It was an old station, almost identical to the one she had left, but now it was bathed in an eerie, unnatural light. The figures standing there were not quite human. Their faces were pale, featureless, and their bodies seemed to shift and distort with every blink of her eyes. They were not real, they were shadows of something else. Ghosts, perhaps, or something far worse. The man in the seat across from her stood. He gave her one final, knowing look and nodded toward the door. "This is where your journey ends," he said, his voice soft. "This is where the final passengers get off. And once you step off this train, there's no turning back." Caroline felt a cold sweat break out across her skin. She wanted to scream, to ask him what he meant, but the words caught in her throat. She was trapped, cornered by something she couldn't understand. The door to the train slid open, and a gust of cold air swept in. The figures on the platform turned toward her, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Caroline knew, deep down, that this was it. This was her destination. She had become the final passenger. With trembling hands, she stood and moved toward the door, each step heavier than the last. The train had stopped, and the moment she stepped onto the platform, the doors would close behind her forever. She felt the weight of the decision in every inch of her body, as though her very existence was at stake. The man's words echoed in her mind. "To the end of your journey." She stepped forward, her feet dragging, as though the ground itself was pulling her down. She could feel the eyes of the shadowy figures on the platform piercing her skin, and her heart raced with the realization that she had no choice but to face whatever lay ahead. And then, with one final step, she crossed the threshold. The moment her foot touched the platform, the world around her seemed to shudder. The station, the figures, everything began to blur and distort, the edges of reality bending like ripples on water. She gasped, stumbling forward, but no sound came from her mouth. It was as though the world had become mute, like her existence was being erased with each passing second. Caroline looked back, expecting to see the train, but it was gone. The platform stretched on endlessly, with no sign of where the train had gone or how it had vanished. The figures on the platform stepped forward, their movements slow and deliberate. They surrounded her, their eyes glowing with an unsettling light. "You're here," one of them whispered, its voice a distant echo. "Welcome to the other side." Caroline's legs gave way beneath her. She collapsed to her knees, her body trembling uncontrollably. This wasn't real. This couldn't be happening. She had to wake up. She had to. The world around her shifted once more, and suddenly, she was no longer on the platform. She was in a room, bare, cold, and devoid of anything familiar. The walls were made of dark stone, and the air was thick with a sense of dread. And there, standing in the center of the room, was the man from the train. He was no longer smiling. His eyes, once kind, were now cold and distant. "You've arrived," he said simply. And in that moment, Caroline understood. She had been chosen to be the final passenger. There was no escaping this place, no way out. The train had taken her here, and now she would remain, just like the others before her, forever. And as the shadows closed in around her, she realized that the final journey had only just begun. The room in which Caroline now found herself was dimly lit by flickering candlelight. The shadows danced along the stone walls, twisting and curling like dark spirits waiting to pounce. She could still feel the weight of the air, heavy with the silence, pressing down on her chest. Her heart pounded in her ears as she tried to comprehend the strange world that surrounded her. The man, the last passenger, was still standing before her, his cold eyes locked onto hers. There was no comfort in his gaze, no kindness, only an eerie calmness that made Caroline feel even more isolated. "You've arrived," he repeated, his voice a soft echo in the vast, empty room. Caroline scrambled to her feet, her mind reeling. This couldn't be real. She had to be dreaming. This had to be some twisted hallucination. The train, the station, the figures, it was all too surreal. "You're not dreaming," the man said, as if reading her thoughts. "This is the reality you've stepped into now. There's no waking up from this." "What is this place?" she demanded, her voice hoarse. "Where are we?" The man smiled, but it was not a reassuring smile. "You're at the end of your journey, the final station, the place where all the lost souls gather." "Lost souls?" Caroline echoed, her heart racing faster. "What are you talking about?" He walked toward her, his steps slow and deliberate. He didn't need to get close. His presence was overwhelming, suffocating. "You weren't supposed to board that train. You were never meant to be on it. But now you are." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "And now you will stay." Caroline took a step back. No, this can't be happening. I don't belong here." "You belong here more than you know," the man said, his voice low. "Everyone who boards the train eventually ends up here. You've crossed into a place beyond time, beyond life. The train isn't just a mode of transportation. It's a choice to enter the unknown." The room began to darken as his words lingered in the air, growing heavier. Caroline tried to make sense of them, but the more she thought, the more confused she became. How could this be real? How could she, of all people, have ended up here? "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why are you here?" The man's smile faded, and for a moment, he seemed almost sad. "I am a passenger, just like you. I arrived the same way you did once. Now I'm something else. The others." He gestured toward the shadows on the walls, where vague shapes seemed to shift and move. "They were once like you as well." Caroline felt a chill run through her as she glanced nervously toward the corners of the room. The shadows seemed to be closing in on her, like silent, creeping figures. She could feel the weight of their gaze, though she couldn't see their faces. "You said they were like me. What happened to them?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man sighed. "They stayed, just like you will." A cold knot tightened in Caroline's stomach. "What do you mean? What happens if I stay?" The man looked at her, his eyes full of a sorrow she couldn't quite understand. "You will become one of them, part of this place. This is the fate of all who board the train. Their journey ends here. They cannot go back. They cannot leave. And neither can you." Caroline's breath hitched. "I can't stay here. I won't. I don't belong with them." The man's eyes softened, but his voice remained firm. "You already are one of them. You just don't realize it yet." Suddenly, the room shifted. The shadows that had been lingering at the edges of her vision grew more distinct, more solid. They took form. Figures that were once human but now stood frozen, their faces pale, their eyes empty. They were passengers like her, she realized, trapped in this place for eternity. A woman with hollow eyes stood to her left, her mouth moving as though trying to speak, but no sound came. A man at the far end of the room stretched out his hand toward Caroline, his body stiff and unyielding. They were frozen in place, like statues, but Caroline could feel the despair radiating from them, the hopelessness of their existence. "You're wrong," Caroline said, shaking her head. "I don't belong here. I won't become one of them." But the man only looked at her with pity, as though he had heard the same words 1,000 times before. "You're already becoming one of them. The train has chosen you. There is no escape." Caroline turned and ran, her feet pounding against the stone floor as she searched for a way out. She could hear the man's footsteps following her, slow but steady, like a shadow she couldn't outrun. The walls seemed to close in on her, the air thickening as though the very space around her was tightening its grip. She reached a doorway at the far end of the room, her heart hammering in her chest. The door creaked open, revealing a dark hallway that stretched into infinity. It was as if she had stepped into a corridor without beginning or end. No light, no sound, only a suffocating darkness. Without thinking, she bolted through the door and down the hallway, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The shadows seemed to move with her, whispering her name in soft, mournful tones. She ran faster, trying to outrun the voices, trying to escape the growing sense of doom that was closing in on her. But the darkness was relentless. Caroline's legs burned as she ran, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the narrow hallway. She didn't dare look back. She knew the man was following her, his footsteps slow but inevitable. The train, the platform, the figures, they were all parts of a cycle she couldn't break. The realization hit her with full force. The train wasn't just transporting passengers to a place. It was transporting them into a never-ending loop, a prison from which there was no escape. The shadows seemed to stretch endlessly around her, warping and changing shape as though the very walls were alive. And then, without warning, the hallway split into multiple paths, each one leading deeper into the darkness. Caroline skidded to a halt. Which way? Which path would lead her out of this nightmare? There were no signs, no indications, just endless darkness. The man's voice echoed from behind her, calm and unwavering. There's nowhere to run. She spun around, heart pounding in her chest. His figure was just a silhouette in the shadows, but she could see the faint outline of his face, his lips curling into a smile. "I told you," he said softly. "You belong here now. We all do." Caroline shook her head, tears blurring her vision. "No, I can't. I won't be one of you." The man's expression softened. "You already are." The words hit her like a wave, crashing over her, drowning her in the realization. She wasn't just lost. She was becoming like the others, trapped in a cycle of despair, bound to this place forever. With a final, desperate scream, Caroline turned and ran down one of the paths, her heart filled with fear and hopelessness. But no matter how fast she ran, no matter how far she went, the darkness would always follow her. She had become the final passenger. Caroline's breath was ragged, her chest heaving with every step she took down the narrow, twisting corridor. The shadows were thickening, clawing at her, wrapping around her like invisible hands. Her heart was a drumbeat in her ears, echoing louder than her footsteps. Every turn she made felt futile. The hallways seemed endless, stretching out forever in all directions. She glanced behind her, but the man was nowhere to be seen. His presence still loomed over her, heavy and oppressive, but there was no sign of his figure. The silence was suffocating. Maybe I can outrun this. But the more she ran, the more her sense of direction faded. The walls, the floors, the very air around her seemed to shift with every step, making her feel as though the very world was conspiring to keep her trapped. Suddenly, she stumbled into an open space, larger than any room she had encountered so far. It was a vast, cavernous hall with no clear entrance or exit, a dark abyss in the center. The edges of the hall blurred into the darkness, and all around her, she could hear the whispers again, low, mournful voices drifting in and out of her consciousness. Caroline stopped in the middle of the hall, trying to steady her breathing. She could feel the eyes of the shadows upon her, watching, waiting. There was no escape, no way out. She was trapped in this endless maze, and every step forward seemed to bring her closer to something far darker than she could comprehend. A low sound echoed through the room. It was a humming, a resonance, like the train's whistle, but warped, twisted, distorted. The sound reverberated in her chest, shaking her to the core. It wasn't a train whistle, though. It was something else, something far older. She turned, instinctively reaching for the walls to steady herself, and that's when she saw it. At the far end of the hall stood a figure, barely visible in the shadows. The shape was tall, imposing, yet unrecognizable. Caroline felt her pulse race as the figure stepped forward, moving slowly toward her. With every step, it became clearer. It wasn't human. The shape was shifting, its form fluctuating between solid and translucent. A monstrous figure with distorted limbs and a face that was neither entirely malevolent nor benevolent. But it had eyes. Eyes that burned with a fierce, cold light. "Who are you?" Caroline managed to choke out, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it tilted its head in a gesture that sent a shiver crawling down her spine. As it came closer, its voice filled her mind. Not with words, but with feelings. Emotions raw and overwhelming. "This is the place where all souls end. You have entered the station of the lost. You cannot leave. You will stay here forever." Caroline shook her head violently. She tried to back away, but her legs wouldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, as if the very ground beneath her had swallowed her up. "I'm not like them," she whispered to herself. "I don't belong here. I won't stay." The figure continued to approach, its glowing eyes never leaving hers. It was almost as if it was savoring her fear, drawing energy from her desperation. Caroline fought the urge to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't obey. She could feel the cold seeping into her bones, the weight of inevitability settling over her like a thick fog. The figure stopped just in front of her, its presence so overwhelming that she felt her breath catch in her throat. The air around her thickened, and the whispers grew louder, swirling in her mind. They were not just voices anymore. They were memories, fragments of forgotten lives, bits of sorrow and regret. She saw flashes of faces, of lives once lived, of journeys taken. And in that moment, she understood. The train, the passengers, the man who had sat across from her, it was all part of this place. The station was a threshold, a liminal space where the souls of the lost wandered endlessly. The passengers were not passengers at all. They were souls bound to this train, forced to relive their final journeys over and over again, never able to escape. Caroline wasn't an exception. She had become just like them, one of the lost, destined to wander the corridors forever. Her body trembled. The weight of the truth hit her with the force of 1,000 crushing blows. She had already crossed the point of no return. There was no going back. The figure in front of her reached out a hand, and as its fingers brushed against her skin, she felt the sensation of freezing cold seeping into her very soul. "Welcome to your new existence," the figure whispered, though its voice was not audible, only felt. "You are now one with the endless cycle." Caroline fell to her knees, the coldness flooding her body. She tried to scream, but no sound came from her mouth. The figure's eyes bored into hers, and she could feel her essence slipping away, dissolving into the air like dust. As her vision blurred, she saw the man, the last passenger, standing just beyond the figure, watching her with an expression that seemed almost sympathetic. He nodded, as if to confirm what she already knew. There was no escape, no release. She was now part of the station, part of the endless cycle of passengers. Her soul would drift through the hallways forever, just like all the others who had boarded the train before her. The last passenger had been right all along. Caroline awoke with a jolt, gasping for air, her heart hammering in her chest. She was back on the train. The seats, the dim lighting, the rhythmic clatter of the tracks. It was all the same. The last passenger sat across from her once again, his cold, knowing eyes fixed on her. "Welcome back," he said, his voice as calm as before. Caroline's throat tightened as she looked around. The train, the passengers, everything was just as it had been before. She had returned to the beginning, but nothing felt the same. Her body felt cold, distant, as though something had been torn away from her. She could feel the truth now, deep within her bones. She was no longer just a passenger. She was part of the station, a soul trapped between worlds. And as the train rumbled on, she realized she would never reach her destination. She would never get off. The cycle had begun again. The final passenger had taken his place once more. The train rumbled on, its steady clatter a monotonous lull that seemed to drag time itself into a void. Caroline sat in her seat, the man across from her still watching, his eyes unwavering, his smile gone. There was no sound other than the rhythm of the tracks beneath them. Her mind felt distant, detached, almost numb. She had come to understand something, a truth that had settled over her like a heavy cloak. The cycle, the eternal return. There was no escape, but something was different this time. She could feel it in the air around her. A strange vibration that didn't belong to the train, to the tracks, or to the familiar, suffocating silence of the passengers. Felt like a shift, a crack in the very fabric of this space. Her gaze wandered across the familiar faces of the other passengers, all locked in their own world, lost in their own personal loops. She saw the woman whose eyes were wide, unblinking, forever staring ahead, the man whose hands trembled slightly as they gripped the armrest. They were all like her, all trapped, but Caroline's focus was drawn back to the train itself, or rather, to a faint flicker of light that appeared at the far end of the car. It wasn't the usual dim illumination from the ceiling lights. This was different. It was brighter, almost ethereal, like the reflection of sunlight off a distant, unseen door. Her heart skipped a beat. The door, it had always been there, just out of her reach. No one had ever acknowledged it, not even the man across from her. But she could see it now, faint yet distinct, standing like a portal to somewhere else, somewhere beyond the confines of the train. Caroline stood up, her legs shaky. She didn't know how long she had been sitting. Days? Hours? Time had no meaning here, but this was a chance, a real, tangible chance to break free. The man's eyes followed her, his expression unreadable, but there was no fear in him. There was no warning, no plea for her to stay. He simply watched. With each step toward the door, her pulse quickened. The passengers around her didn't react. They didn't even seem to notice the shift, the presence of the door that beckoned her forward. They were stuck in their own endless loops. Only Caroline was aware. She reached out and touched the handle. It was cold, colder than the rest of the train, as if it had been waiting for her all this time, patiently. With a deep breath, she twisted the handle and pushed. The door opened with a soft creak, revealing a bright, blinding light that flooded the car. It wasn't the sterile white of the train's usual lights. It was a warm, golden hue, like the first rays of sunlight breaking through a storm. It was the light of something real, something alive. Caroline stepped forward without hesitation, her body moving on instinct. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The train, the passengers, the endless cycle, they no longer mattered. She was free. She stepped through the doorway and into the light. The moment she crossed the threshold, everything changed. The air was different, fresher, cleaner. It felt as though she had been reborn, as though the weight that had been pressing on her chest for what felt like an eternity had been lifted. She stood in a vast open field, the grass swaying gently in the breeze. The sky above her was blue, dotted with clouds, but not the cold, oppressive sky of the station. This sky was alive, vibrant, with a depth that made her feel small, insignificant, and yet strangely at peace. In the distance, she saw a figure approaching. It was a woman, her face kind, her eyes full of understanding. As she drew closer, Caroline realized it was someone she had never seen before, someone who didn't belong to the train. The woman smiled warmly, and without a word, she extended her hand. "You've made it," the woman said, her voice soothing, like a gentle melody. "You've broken the cycle." Caroline reached out hesitantly, but as her hand met the woman's, she felt an overwhelming sense of calm wash over her, like a weight finally being lifted. The world felt real, tangible. She wasn't a passenger anymore. She wasn't a lost soul trapped in an endless loop. She was free. "You were always meant for this," the woman said softly. "You had to believe in the possibility of something beyond. And now you are here." Caroline looked around at the endless field, the golden light that bathed everything. It was a place of peace, of rest. It was home. "I didn't think I would ever get out," Caroline murmured, her voice barely audible. The woman nodded. The train was a test, a journey for those who lost their way, those who were stuck between worlds. "But now you have crossed over." Caroline's heart swelled with emotion. She had made it. She had fought through the darkness, through the endless corridors, and now she was here. She was free. As she looked back toward the door she had stepped through, the train was gone. There was no sign of it, no tracks, no echoes, no reminder of the dark, suffocating space she had left behind. It had all disappeared. "What happens now?" Caroline asked, her voice trembling. The woman smiled again, a soft, knowing smile. "Now you live. You are no longer bound to the past, to the train, to the station. You can start anew." Caroline felt the weight of her past life, her old self, drifting away, like a distant memory she no longer needed to carry. She was free. She turned to face the woman, ready to embrace whatever came next, when she suddenly heard a sound, soft at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. The voice was familiar. "You're not free yet." Caroline froze. The voice, it was the man, the last passenger. She turned around quickly, but there was nothing. No train, no doorway, just the vast, endless field stretching out before her. The woman beside her seemed to sense her hesitation. "He cannot reach you here," she said gently. "You have passed beyond him." Caroline looked at the woman, a faint smile on her lips. For the first time since her journey began, she truly felt at peace. And with that, Caroline took her first real step into the world beyond, leaving the shadows of the train and the last passenger behind. Story 4. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside the warehouse was the silence. It wasn't the ordinary kind, the silence that happens when there's no one around or when machinery has stopped. It was something deeper, something unnatural. The air was thick with it. I'd been working at the warehouse for months, but this place had always felt different. My job was simple enough: sort inventory, check supplies, make sure everything was in its place. But there were nights when the stillness felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in, like the shadows were alive, watching. I tried to shake the feeling off as I adjusted my flashlight. The warehouse was enormous, rows and rows of steel shelves stacked high with boxes and crates. The beams overhead creaked occasionally, the wind howling through gaps in the windows, but all I could hear was that silence. The air smelled of dust and stale wood, the remnants of years of neglect, but even that didn't seem right. There was a distinct odor here, faint but unmistakable. A chemical smell, sharp, metallic. It lingered in the back of my throat, making it hard to breathe. I took another step forward, the heavy boots of my uniform clattering against the concrete floor. My flashlight flickered for a moment, and I had to smack it to get it back to life. When it did, the beam caught something, a shadow just at the edge of the light. I froze. I told myself it was nothing, just the usual tricks that a dark, abandoned warehouse played on your mind. But the more I stared into the dim corners, the more I realized it wasn't nothing. It was something. I could feel it pressing in on me, a weight that seemed to crawl under my skin. "Hello," I called, my voice cracking in the stillness. The sound of it bounced off the steel shelves, coming back to me like a distant echo. No response. It was always like this. The warehouse was filled with the remnants of broken machines, forgotten tools, and piles of old stock. Yet, every time I worked late, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one here. I turned the corner, the shadows in the next aisle stretching unnaturally long. The beam of my flashlight swept across the shelves, illuminating the odd, forgotten objects. Crates of rusted tools, boxes of outdated electronics, a tangle of cables that looked like they had been left behind for years. But it wasn't the shelves that made my skin crawl. It was the sound, the faintest echo, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. It was like a whisper. No, not a whisper, a hum. Low and almost imperceptible. I felt it before I heard it, a vibration in the air. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I stopped walking, listening. The hum grew louder. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere far off, somewhere deep within the warehouse. My eyes darted across the rows of shelves, looking for the source. I moved cautiously, stepping lightly on the concrete, trying not to make a sound. Another step, then another. The echo was louder now. It wasn't just a hum, it was a voice I couldn't quite understand. I had to know what it was. I had to find it. I turned another corner, heading deeper into the warehouse. The further I went, the colder it became. The hum pulsed through the air, vibrating my chest now. It was growing stronger, clearer, and that's when I saw it. At the end of the row was a small, unmarked door, tucked away between two towering shelves. The door wasn't supposed to be there. I knew that for sure. I'd worked in this warehouse long enough to know every inch of it. There was no door in this section, not one like that. I walked towards it, drawn to it as if something was pulling me closer. The hum was now a near painful buzz, ringing in my ears. I reached the door, my hand trembling as I touched the handle. I could feel it. Whatever was on the other side, it was waiting for me to open it. Without thinking, I turned the handle. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a narrow, dark hallway beyond. It was a strange room, or perhaps a hidden part of the warehouse I hadn't known existed. The air inside was colder, the smell more pungent, like chemicals but stronger, and it was darker than any part of the warehouse I had ever seen. I stepped inside. The hallway stretched ahead, vanishing into an oppressive darkness. The hum was louder now, a low thrumming sound, almost like machinery, but I could tell it wasn't machinery. It was something else, something far older, far darker. I took a step forward, the darkness swallowing me whole. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thick with tension. Each footstep echoed around me, bouncing off unseen surfaces. I felt like I was being followed, like the silence was not just empty but alive, listening to my every move. I turned a corner, and that's when I saw it. A large, rusted metal door at the end of the hallway. It stood there, looming, as if it had been waiting for me. The humming sound was coming from behind it now, vibrating through the walls, through the air itself. It was louder than ever before, and the closer I got, the more I felt it. A pulsating energy that seemed to flow through the very ground beneath me. I knew I shouldn't open it. I knew it was a mistake, but I couldn't stop myself. Something was calling me, drawing me in. I reached for the handle. The cold metal handle was slick beneath my hand, as if it had been waiting for someone to touch it. My fingers wrapped around it instinctively, and before I could stop myself, I twisted it. The door creaked open with a noise that echoed far too loudly for something so small, as if the very hinges were reluctant to let it move. I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest, the humming sound now a sharp, discordant buzz that seemed to vibrate through the floor. It felt like the walls themselves were alive, breathing in time with the strange noise. The room behind the door was much smaller than I'd expected. It was a cramped space, with low ceilings and flickering fluorescent lights hanging from the walls, their light dim and buzzing erratically. Felt like a forgotten place, hidden away, untouched by time. I was standing in what looked like an old storage room, but the shelves lining the walls were strange. They weren't filled with the usual crates or machinery I was used to seeing. Instead, they held odd, mismatched items. Some were unmarked boxes. Others were strange, unidentifiable objects that looked like they had been pulled from the darkest corners of some forgotten world. There were old books, dust-covered and tattered, with pages that had yellowed with age. And in one corner, a large, covered object that seemed out of place, as if it had been left there intentionally, deliberately hidden. I stepped further into the room, my flashlight catching glimmers of something metallic, something that seemed to shimmer for just a moment before vanishing into the shadows. The hum was louder now, almost deafening. It was no longer just a sound. It was a feeling, a vibration that seemed to pulse through me. I moved toward the covered object in the corner, my curiosity overpowering any rational thought. The object was large, draped in a thick, dusty tarp that hung loosely over its shape. I reached out, hesitated for a moment, and then pulled the cloth away. The moment the fabric touched the ground, I felt the temperature drop, the air becoming thick and heavy. The object beneath the tarp was metallic, old, and covered in layers of grime and rust. It was a large, complex machine of some sort, its purpose entirely unclear to me. Pipes and wires snaked across its surface, connecting parts that seemed both futuristic and archaic at the same time. A large, dark screen was embedded into the center, its surface cracked, but there was no mistaking the strange, unnatural energy that emanated from it. It pulsed, faintly, like a heart beating too slowly. I reached forward, my hand trembling as I brushed my fingers along the surface of the machine. The moment I touched it, the hum in the air grew louder, a sharp, piercing noise that seemed to vibrate directly into my bones. My vision blurred for a split second, and I staggered back, almost falling over. I shook my head, trying to clear the disorientation. Something wasn't right. The walls felt like they were closing in, the temperature dropping even further. I took a step back, trying to make sense of what I had just touched. And that's when I heard it. A voice, a whisper, soft and barely audible, but unmistakable. It was coming from somewhere in the room, or perhaps from the machine itself. I turned, my heart racing. "Don't touch it," the voice said, the words jagged and strained, as if they had been spoken through layers of static. "It will listen. It will remember." I froze, my blood running cold. The room was now eerily still, the hum gone. For a moment, I thought I had imagined the voice, but then I heard it again, this time louder, clearer. "It calls you." I spun around, trying to locate the source of the voice, but there was no one. The room was empty, the shelves still, the only movement the faint swaying of the flickering lights above me. The voice had come from the machine. I took a hesitant step toward the machine again, my breath shallow. I had to know. I had to understand what this was. The room felt suffocating, but there was something pulling me in, a compulsion to get closer, to interact with it, as if the machine itself was calling me. I reached out again, this time with more purpose. My fingers grazed the screen of the machine, and the moment I touched it, I felt the world shift around me. The walls seemed to dissolve into shadows, and the floor beneath my feet seemed to vanish. The air became heavy, thick, and I felt myself falling. It wasn't just the machine that was reacting. It was the entire room. The space around me was warping, bending, as if it were alive, shifting in response to my presence. My vision darkened, the edges of the room becoming fuzzy, indistinct. I could hear voices now, distant and disembodied, overlapping in a chaotic blur. Whispers, screams, murmurs that I couldn't understand, but that carried a weight and urgency. I tried to pull away, but it was too late. The machine had already begun to draw me in. I could feel it, like an invisible force tugging at my chest, pulling me deeper into the void that had suddenly opened up before me. I stumbled back, trying to free myself, but the room was no longer solid. I could feel myself slipping into it, becoming part of it, as if the walls themselves had become liquid, and I was sinking, falling into them. Then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The darkness receded. The walls solidified. The room was quiet again. I blinked, disoriented, struggling to make sense of what had just happened. I was standing in the same spot, in the same room. The machine loomed before me, silent, its hum gone. I was no longer alone. There, standing in the doorway, was someone I didn't recognize. A man. His features were obscured by shadows, but I could see enough to know that he wasn't from the warehouse. His eyes were dark, impossibly dark, and his expression was one of quiet observation, like he had been waiting for me. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, hoarse from the fear that had gripped me moments before. He didn't answer at first. He simply stepped forward, his presence filling the room. "Did you hear it?" he asked. His voice was calm, detached, but there was an edge to it, something that made my heart race. "Hear what?" I stammered, taking a step back. "The call," he said simply. "It's always there, calling." I swallowed hard. I didn't know what he meant, but I was beginning to understand. The machine, the voices, the hum. It wasn't just a malfunction or a strange piece of equipment. It was something more, something ancient. And now it was clear. I wasn't the first to have come here. The echo had called, and now it was waiting for me. The man stepped further into the room, his movements slow, deliberate. There was something unsettling about him, something that set my nerves on edge. His face remained shrouded in darkness, but the aura of quiet knowledge about him was palpable. He wasn't scared. He wasn't even surprised by my presence here, as if this was all part of a plan, part of a cycle he had seen before. I took another step back, my mind racing. Every instinct I had screamed for me to run, to leave, to get out of this place before it swallowed me whole. But the pull was still there, faint but persistent, drawing me toward the machine. I couldn't understand it. I had to understand it. "Who are you?" I asked again, my voice a little stronger this time. The man finally stepped fully into the light, and that was when I saw him clearly. He was older than I had first guessed, maybe in his late 50s or early 60s. His skin was pale, his hair thin and graying at the temples. His eyes, though, were the strangest part, pale, almost milky, but sharp in a way that made me feel like he could see straight through me. "You know what this place is, don't you?" he asked, his voice soft, but it carried a weight that made it seem like a command, not a question. I shook my head. "No, I don't understand." The man let out a long, tired sigh, almost as if he'd been waiting for me to say that. "The echo calls," he said simply, glancing toward the machine. "It always calls." My pulse quickened. "What do you mean by the echo?" He didn't answer right away, instead turning to face the machine, his expression distant. The hum, which had faded during my brief conversation with him, suddenly returned, low and ominous, vibrating through the floor and into my bones. It was like the machine was alive, waiting for something, or someone. The echo isn't just a sound. The man began, his voice low, almost reverent. It's a doorway, a passageway to another realm, a place between the living and the dead. This warehouse, this room, it holds something ancient, something dangerous. I took a hesitant step forward, despite the warning bells going off in my head. What is it? The man turned toward me, his pale eyes narrowing. It's a force, a presence that has been here long before this building was constructed. It's the echo of a long-dead entity, trapped between worlds. It feeds on the living, and once it has you, it doesn't let go. I felt a chill creep down my spine. So this machine is the key, he interrupted. The doorway, but it needs someone to open it. It needs someone to hear the call, someone who is willing to unlock it. I glanced nervously at the machine. Its surface was covered in grime, but I could see faint symbols etched into it, barely visible under the layers of dust. They seemed almost alive, shifting subtly, as though they were moving beneath the surface. Felt like they were watching me, waiting. I turned back to the man. Why haven't you left? If you know what this place is, why are you still here? He looked at me for a long moment, a sadness settling in his gaze. Because I'm trapped, just like everyone else. It won't let me go. I thought I could control it, contain it, but it's always been stronger than me. My breath caught in my throat. What do you mean? How long have you been here? He didn't answer at first, and when he did, his voice was strained, like the weight of the memory was too much to bear. I was the one who found it. Long ago, I was working here just like you. I didn't understand what I was dealing with. I didn't know it would change everything. What happened? I asked, my voice trembling. I opened the door, he said softly, almost as if speaking to himself. I thought I could control it, contain it, but once the door is opened, there's no closing it again. It starts with whispers. You hear it at night in your dreams. The hum. You try to ignore it, but it gets louder and louder until it consumes you. It draws you in, and once you've heard it, you can't unhear it. I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on me. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, colder. The machine pulsed, its hum growing louder, vibrating through the very ground beneath my feet. It felt like the entire room was alive, like it was responding to our conversation. I stepped back, my heart pounding. How do we stop it? How do we close the door? He shook his head, a bitter smile crossing his lips. You don't. You can't stop it once it's awake. The only way to escape is to never hear the call. But you've already heard it, haven't you? I swallowed hard. What do you mean? The echo, he said, his voice almost a whisper. Once it calls, it never stops. And now it's calling you. You can't outrun it. You can't escape it. You're already a part of it. The air seemed to shift around me. The hum had become deafening, almost unbearable. It was no longer just a sound. It was like it was in my head, inside my mind, drowning out everything else. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. I could only hear the hum. It was consuming me. I staggered, disoriented, and fell to my knees. The man's voice was distant now, almost drowned out by the echo. Remember, he said, his words fading as if he were slipping away. It remembers. It always remembers. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The hum disappeared. The room was still. silent. I looked around, disoriented, my heart racing. The man was gone. There was no trace of him, no sign that he had ever been there. It was as if he had never existed. The room was the same as it had been before, but now it felt different. He was right. I couldn't escape it. The call, the echo, it had already taken root in me. I looked back at the machine. It was waiting, and I knew deep down that it was only a matter of time before I would have to answer. The next few days were a blur. I tried to shake off what had happened in that room, to convince myself that it had all been some strange dream, a figment of my imagination. But the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about the man, about the machine, about the echo that had drawn me in. I tried to go back to my regular routine at the warehouse, to work like I had before. But the hum was always there, in the background, like a constant presence. It wasn't as loud as it had been that night, but it was there, quiet, persistent, like a whisper I couldn't ignore. I found myself staring at the walls, at the shelves, at the faint symbols etched into the machines. I could almost hear them, feel them shifting in the shadows. The more I tried to ignore it, the louder it became. The warehouse felt different now. The air was thick with tension, as if something was waiting for me, watching me. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I was being followed. I felt the eyes of the building on me, every step I took. And then one night it happened. I was working late, just like always, when I heard a noise, soft at first, like a distant murmur. It wasn't the hum of the machine. It was something else, something more familiar. A voice. Come back. It was barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. The voice from the machine. I turned, my heart racing, but there was no one there. The warehouse was empty, as it always was at night, but I could feel it deep in my bones. The echo was calling again, and this time I knew I couldn't ignore it. I stood frozen in the middle of the warehouse, my breath shallow and quick, my pulse thumping in my ears. The whisper, the voice, had come again, the same haunting command, soft and insistent. Come back! It was almost too faint to catch, like a distant memory scratching at the edge of my mind. I turned slowly, scanning the empty space. The shelves, the machines, the worn-out boxes, all of it was just as I had left it. But something was different. The air felt thick, heavier, charged with a kind of energy that made my skin prickle. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. My legs moved on their own accord, carrying me toward the door, but before I could reach it, I heard it again. This time it was louder, clearer, and much closer. The voice didn't come from the shadows or from behind me. It came from inside me. It echoed in my mind like a thought I couldn't dismiss. It remembers. You will remember. I stumbled, my head spinning. The words didn't make sense, and yet they felt like a part of me, like something I had always known but had forgotten. A sudden burst of cold air swept across the room, and I froze in place. It wasn't the chill of the warehouse. It was something else entirely, an unnatural cold, as though the very air had become tainted by something ancient and dark. I felt it, it was here. The hum returned, louder this time, vibrating through my chest. The sensation was all-encompassing. It wasn't just the sound now. It was a physical presence, pressing in on me from all sides. It was the weight of it, the suffocating pressure. It was like being trapped inside a storm, but with no wind or rain. Just the unrelenting force of the echo. I reached for my phone, my hands shaking, but as soon as I unlocked the screen, it flickered once, twice, and then went completely black. The device was useless. No signal, no connection, just me and whatever was inside this warehouse. My stomach churned. I had to know. I had to understand what had happened to me, what this place was, and what this thing, the echo, was calling me to do. My legs moved against my will, carrying me back toward the room where it all began. The storage room, the machine. I couldn't stop it. I didn't want to stop it. As I approached the door, the temperature dropped even further. The walls seemed to breathe around me, the faint hum resonating in my bones. The shadows in the hallway stretched longer, twisting like living creatures. The lights flickered, casting strange shapes against the walls. I reached for the door handle, my fingers icy, the metal cool beneath my touch. It opened with a quiet groan, and the air in the room felt heavy, thick with a presence I couldn't describe. I could feel it. It was here again. The machine was waiting for me, its metal surface gleaming in the low light. The symbols were no longer faint. They pulsed with an eerie light, shifting ever so slightly, as if they were alive. The hum was louder now, the sound filling the entire room, vibrating through the floor beneath my feet. It was as if the machine itself was breathing. I stepped closer, the air growing colder with each step I took. The voice was clearer now, filling my mind, twisting my thoughts. Come closer. You must listen. My hand hovered over the surface of the machine, trembling, my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to leave, to walk away. But I couldn't. The pull was too strong. I placed my hand on the machine. The moment I did, a jolt of cold electricity shot up my arm, sending a shockwave of energy through my body. My vision blurred, the world around me spinning. The hum became deafening, like 1,000 voices all speaking at once, overlapping and distorting into an incoherent mess. And then, silence. The room became still, as if the very air had been sucked out. The machine pulsed once, twice, and then the hum stopped completely. The room was silent. For a moment, I thought I had passed out, but then I felt it. Presence. A figure standing in the doorway. I whipped around, my heart racing. The man from before, the one who had warned me, but this time he wasn't just a shadow. He was solid, his pale eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "You've done it now," he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 regrets. I took a step back, fear rising in my chest. What do you mean? What's happening?" His eyes softened for a moment, a flicker of something resembling sympathy in them. "You've opened the door whether you wanted to or not. You've made contact, and now there's no going back." I shook my head. I didn't mean to. "It doesn't matter," he interrupted, his tone hardening. "It's awake now. It's coming for you." I stepped back toward the door, my mind reeling. "What are you talking about? What is this thing? What does it want?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he seemed to look at me, sizing me up, as if he were deciding whether to tell me more. "It's not about what it wants. It's about what it needs. It needs you, and once it has you, it won't let go." I felt my legs give out beneath me, but I caught myself on the edge of the table. "But why? What is it?" The man's gaze darkened. "The machine, it's not just a tool. It's a prison for something ancient, something that has been waiting for millennia to be released. And you've just freed it." I felt my breath catch in my throat. No, I didn't." He stepped forward, placing a cold hand on my shoulder, his grip like iron. "You don't get it. You've already made the choice. You don't get to undo it. Not anymore." The hum returned, this time louder than ever, vibrating through the walls, through the floor, through my very bones. I felt it in my chest, in my throat, a pressure that made it hard to breathe. The air grew colder still, and the shadows in the room began to shift, twisting and writhing, as though something was trying to break through them. The man stepped back, his face pale with fear. "You have to go. It's coming." Before I could respond, he turned and fled, disappearing into the shadows. I stood there, frozen, my heart racing, my mind reeling. The machine, whatever it was, had been awakened, and now there was no escaping it. The hum was louder now, almost deafening. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thicker, more oppressive. I could feel it, that presence again. The thing behind the machine, the thing that had been waiting all this time. And now it was coming for me. The air was thick with an unnatural cold. Every step I took felt heavier, as though the weight of the room itself was pressing down on me. The shadows moved, not with the fluidity of light and darkness, but with an unnatural purpose, swirling and shifting as if they had a life of their own. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The hum had become unbearable. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was a presence, vibrating in my chest, filling my entire body with an overwhelming pressure. My head pounded. My thoughts were a tangled mess of fear and confusion. The machine in front of me seemed to pulse with life, its surface gleaming in the faint light, and the symbols on it flickered with an eerie glow. It was no longer just an inanimate object. It was a force, an entity, and it was alive. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. I had been drawn to it since the first moment I stepped into this place, and now I understood why. I had awoken something ancient and powerful, and it was calling me, demanding something from me that I couldn't quite grasp. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, but my legs were frozen. I couldn't move. The presence in the room had intensified, as if it were gathering strength, pulling itself together, preparing to make its move. And I was at the center of it all. "You cannot run." The voice echoed in my mind again, louder now, stronger than ever before. It was neither male nor female, but something between both. It was disembodied, yet it felt as if it was coming from everywhere, surrounding me, drowning me in its presence. I wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but my feet were glued to the floor. My body refused to obey. "You are already ours." A sharp jolt ran through my body, and for a moment, everything went black. I felt weightless, as though I were floating. The sound of the hum had faded, replaced by a deep silence that felt even more suffocating. When my vision returned, I was no longer in the warehouse. The room had transformed into something else entirely. The shadows were darker, deeper, and the air was thick with an oppressive force that pressed in on me from all sides. I was standing on a stone floor, surrounded by walls made of dark, jagged rock. The ceiling arched high above me, and I could hear the distant sound of dripping water echoing in the far corners of the cavernous space. It was cold, frigid in fact, and the temperature cut through me like needles against my skin. I reached out, my hands trembling, but there was nothing around me, just the vast emptiness of the place. The echoes of my own breath were swallowed by the cavernous space. I turned, expecting to see something behind me, but it was empty. And then I heard it, a sound, faint at first, barely audible, but growing louder. A low, guttural rumble that seemed to reverberate through the stone. It was the hum, the same hum, but deeper, darker, as though it were coming from the very heart of the earth. "You have come." The voice was clear now, unmistakable. It was the same voice I had heard before, but now it felt more real, as though it was not only in my mind but surrounding me, inside me, vibrating in the very air around me. I turned in every direction, but there was no source. "You have opened the door." The words echoed, reverberating through the stone. They made my skin crawl, sending waves of cold through me. Couldn't breathe. My heart raced. The weight of it all pressed down on me, suffocating me. The hum grew louder, more insistent. I felt as though the walls of this place were closing in on me. I backed away, my hands stretched out in front of me, trying to feel for something, anything that could help me escape. But there was nothing, just darkness and the overwhelming sense that I was being watched. You cannot escape what you have awakened. The voice was different now, more threatening. It resonated in my bones, vibrating through my body like a drumbeat. My legs gave way beneath me, and I collapsed to my knees. I could feel the cold stone beneath me, but the chill didn't seem to matter anymore. It was the presence that I could no longer ignore, the sense that something was coming. Something was reaching for me. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the hum stopped. A strange silence settled over me. The oppressive weight that had surrounded me was gone, and for a moment, I thought I might have imagined it all. Perhaps I was just disoriented, delirious from fear. But then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move in the shadows. It was like a figure, long and twisted, stretching toward me from the darkness. Its shape was indistinct, its edges shifting and warping, but I could feel its presence. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. It was watching me. "Come closer," the voice whispered. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my body refused to respond. My feet were frozen in place, my arms rigid by my sides. The figure was moving toward me now, its form becoming clearer with every step. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its movements were unnatural, as if it were floating, gliding across the ground with no concern for gravity. I could hear its breath now, deep and ragged, like the sound of something ancient, something not meant to exist. "You opened the door. Now you belong to me." I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. It wasn't the touch of a living being. It was something else, something colder than death, colder than the stone around me. I couldn't move. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat echoing louder and louder until it became a deafening drum. "You cannot hide from me. You belong to the echo now." And then, in an instant, I was back in the warehouse. The room around me was dim, the same as it had been before. But something was different. The shadows were deeper now. The hum was still there, but quieter, almost a whisper, like a warning. I stood frozen, my body trembling. It was real. The echo, the presence, the thing that had been waiting for me. The voice had spoken the truth. There was no escaping it. I had opened the door, and now I was bound to it, to whatever it was. I took a deep breath, my head spinning. My heart was still pounding in my chest. I glanced around the room, looking for some sign of escape, but there was none. The shadows pressed in from all sides, and the hum, faint but constant, vibrated beneath my skin. I had made my choice, and now there was no turning back. The echo was not just sound anymore. It was a living presence, crawling under my skin, sinking deep into my bones. It followed me wherever I went, a constant hum in the background of my thoughts, a shadow that lurked just beyond my peripheral vision. I could feel it now, surrounding me, its cold, insistent grasp tightening around me, its invisible fingers playing with my mind. Every corner of the warehouse felt claustrophobic, as though the walls were shrinking in on me. I could no longer tell if the shadows were shifting on their own or if I was just imagining them, but every flicker of movement sent a jolt of panic through me. Every step I took felt like a step deeper into a nightmare that I could not wake from. I glanced around desperately, looking for any sign of escape, but there was none. The door was still locked, the window sealed shut. The place I had thought was merely an old, abandoned warehouse had now turned into a suffocating trap, a cage built from shadows and memories. The echo was everywhere. It was inside me now, too, its voice whispering, not just in my mind, but in my soul. You opened the door. Now you belong to me. It was not just a warning, it was a statement of fact. A truth that was woven into the fabric of this place. A truth I couldn't deny. I had thought that I could leave, that I could walk away from the machine and forget what had happened here. But the echo had been waiting. It had been waiting for me, and now that it had me, there was no escaping it. I staggered back, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my vision blurry. The warehouse, which had once seemed so vast and full of possibilities, now felt like a tomb. It was as if I had entered a space outside of time, a space where the normal rules of reality no longer applied. The cold was unbearable. It cut through me like 1,000 shards of ice, and the hum. It was relentless, a constant presence, pressing in on me from all sides. You cannot leave. The voice was clearer now, sharper, as if the echo itself had taken form, speaking directly to me. You belong here, with me, forever. I clutched my head, trying to block out the voice, but it was impossible. It was inside my thoughts, inside my very being. I couldn't escape it. There was no place for me to hide. I stumbled forward, my eyes desperately searching the dark corners of the room for any kind of exit, but all I saw was the machine. Its surface shimmered with that strange, flickering light, the symbols glowing like they were alive. The hum seemed to come from within it, as though it were emanating from the very core of the machine. It's time, the voice whispered. You will understand soon enough. I shook my head, refusing to believe it. There was no way. This couldn't be real. It was just an old warehouse, just an old, broken machine. It couldn't be alive. But the moment I thought it, I felt it. The shift. Something deep inside me, something that had been buried for so long, stirred awake. It wasn't just the hum that had changed, it was me. I could feel it in my chest, in my blood. It was like the machine had reached into me and tethered something inside me to it. Something I didn't even know was there. Connection. I reached out, my hand trembling, and placed it on the cold surface of the machine. The moment I did, the world around me seemed to twist. The shadows deepened, swirling around me like a vortex. I felt as though I were being pulled into it, pulled into the very core of the machine, into the darkness that lay within. It is time. The voice was louder now, no longer a whisper, but a roar, deafening and all-consuming. Come, become part of me. The cold was overwhelming, unbearable. My heart pounded in my chest, my lungs struggling to take in air. But I couldn't pull my hand away. I couldn't move. It was as if the machine had control of me now, binding me to it, pulling me deeper into its dark, mechanical heart. And then it stopped. The world stilled. The hum faded into nothing. The cold lifted, and for a moment, there was silence. But I was no longer alone. The presence was there in the very air around me, in the walls, in the machine. It was here with me, watching, waiting. I opened my eyes, and the warehouse was gone. I was standing in the middle of a vast, dark expanse. The floor beneath me was not stone anymore, but smooth and black, almost reflective, like polished obsidian. The air was thick with an unnatural fog, swirling around my feet, and the temperature was impossibly cold. I could see nothing but shadows stretching out in all directions, as though I were standing in an endless void. And then I heard it again. The hum, low, deep, alive. It vibrated through me, into my very bones, filling the void with its presence. But now there was something else, something more. I looked around, and in the distance I saw it. A figure, tall, silent, watching. It was waiting for me. The figure moved, slow but deliberate, its form shifting in and out of focus. It had no face, no features, only an outline of dark, shifting shadows that seemed to warp with every step it took. It was no longer just an echo, no longer just a voice. It had become something that existed in the very fabric of this place. Part of it. "Come closer," the voice commanded. "The binding is complete." I took a step forward, my body moving as if it were no longer my own. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't stop any of it. It was like the very air was pulling me toward the figure, toward the presence, toward the echo. And I understood then what it had been saying, what it had meant. I had been chosen. I had opened the door, and in doing so, I had bound myself to it. To it, the echo, the thing that had been waiting. And now there was no turning back, no escape. The figure reached out a hand, or what seemed to be a hand, a swirling mass of darkness that stretched toward me. And as it did, the final pieces of my consciousness shattered. There was no sound now, no hum, no voice, just the endless, suffocating darkness as I was pulled deeper into the void. And I realized, with an undeniable certainty, that I would never leave this place. Not ever. The warehouse stood silent once more. The machine hummed faintly, its cymbals glowing softly in the dim light. The shadows of the room remained still, unmoving, as if waiting for something, for someone. And deep within the dark void, where Caroline had once stood, the echo waited, watching, listening, ready to claim its next victim. Story 5. I never wanted to go back to the factory. The sight of its crumbling red brick walls and the soot-stained windows had haunted me for years. I'd left that place behind when I was 18, promising myself I'd never return. But here I was, back in front of the gates, clutching the rusty key that had arrived in the mail 2 days ago. It wasn't just the key, though. It was the note that had come with it. Scrawled in handwriting I almost recognized. "You're needed. Tonight. Midnight." Curiosity had overridden fear, and now I stood there, staring at the building that loomed like a slumbering beast in the dim moonlight. The factory had been abandoned for years, shut down after a fire gutted half of it. It was supposed to be off-limits, condemned even. Yet here I was, drawn by an urge I couldn't explain. The key slipped easily into the padlock, and the gate creaked open. The sound echoed unnaturally, as though the air itself were holding its breath. I stepped inside, the stale scent of burnt wood and grease rushing to greet me. The hallway stretched out before me, dark and endless, lit only by the faint glow of my flashlight. I'd barely taken a few steps when I noticed it, a faint, flickering light at the end of the corridor. It wasn't the warm yellow of a bulb or the sterile white of a fluorescent tube. It was something else entirely. It pulsed faintly, its glow pale and cold, almost otherworldly. I should have turned back right then. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to lock the gate behind me and pretend I never got that key. But something about the light drew me in like a moth to a flame. Couldn't resist. My footsteps echoed as I approached, each step louder than the last. The factory had always been massive, its labyrinthine hallways stretching far beyond what seemed possible. I'd spent my childhood playing hide-and-seek here while my father worked in the assembly line. Back then, the factory had buzzed with life. Now it was dead except for the light. As I got closer, I realized the glow wasn't coming from a fixture. It was hovering in the air, suspended like a ghostly orb. It flickered rhythmically, almost like it was breathing. For a moment, I froze, unsure if I was dreaming. But then the orb pulsed brighter, and I swear I heard it. A faint hum, low and resonant, like the sound of a distant machine coming to life. I reached out, hesitant but compelled. As my hand brushed the edge of the glow, a sudden jolt shot through me. like static electricity magnified 1,000 times. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my ears ringing, and then I heard the voice. "You shouldn't have come." It wasn't loud, but it was clear. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, as though the walls themselves were speaking. My flashlight flickered, and I turned around, expecting to see someone. But there was nothing, just the endless dark behind me and the glowing orb in front of me. The voice didn't speak again, but I could feel its presence lingering in the air, pressing against my skin like static. The light dimmed, almost as if it were retreating, and instinctively, I followed. I don't know why. It wasn't logic or courage that drove me forward. It was something deeper, something primal. The factory had always felt alive to me as a kid, with its grinding machinery and the rhythmic clatter of conveyor belts. But this was different. It wasn't alive in the way a building full of people is alive. It was alive in the way a predator watches its prey. The orb led me deeper into the factory, through hallways I didn't remember and into rooms that felt impossibly large. The further I went, the more the air seemed to change. It grew colder, heavier, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. My flashlight's beams seemed weaker here, swallowed by the shadows. And then I saw them. Faint impressions on the dusty floor, footprints leading toward the orb. They weren't mine. Someone else had been here recently. The footprints led me to what used to be the break room. The door was slightly ajar, and from within, I could hear the faint sound of metal scraping against metal. My heart pounded as I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning loudly in the silence. Inside, the room was almost untouched by time. Rusting lockers lined the walls, and an overturned table sat in the center. But what caught my eye was the machinery. There were small, intricate machines scattered across the room, all of them in various stages of repair. They looked like they hadn't been touched in decades, but they hummed softly, as if they were still alive. And then I saw him. A man sat hunched over one of the machines, his back to me. He was wearing the old factory uniform, blue coveralls stained with grease and soot. His hands moved deftly, adjusting gears and tightening screws. "Hello!" My voice came out shaky, uncertain. The man froze. Slowly, he turned to face me. His face was pale, his eyes sunken and lifeless. But it was his expression that sent chills down my spine. He looked surprised, almost relieved. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's sunken eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The hum of the glowing orb in the distance filled the silence, an ever-present reminder that we weren't alone. "I got a key," I stammered, holding it up as if it might explain my presence. "It said I needed to come here." At the mention of the key, his expression shifted. The faint relief I thought I saw moments before vanished, replaced by something darker, fear, or maybe resignation. "They sent for you," he muttered, almost to himself. He looked back at the machine he was working on, his hands trembling now as he tightened a bolt. "I told them no more. I told them it's not right." "What's not right?" I asked, stepping closer. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared down at the machine, his fingers running along its surface as if he were soothing it. Finally, he said, "You don't leave once you've been called. They don't let you." A chill ran down my spine. "Who's they?" He glanced at me, his hollow eyes filled with something close to pity. "The ones who stay, the ones who built this place." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "The factory's been abandoned for years. No one's here but us. You think that because you're still on the outside," he said, his voice growing softer, as if speaking louder might wake something. "But you'll see. They're watching. They're always watching. Before I could ask more, the man rose abruptly and motioned for me to follow. If they sent for you, then you've already started the process. You need to see it. Maybe then you'll understand. His words filled me with dread, but I couldn't stop myself from following him. He led me out of the break room and down another corridor. This one was darker, the air colder. The orb hovered ahead of us, lighting the way like a ghostly guide. We reached a heavy metal door at the end of the hall. The man paused, placing a hand on the door as if to steady himself. "This is where it begins," he said. The door creaked open, and I stepped into a cavernous room filled with towering machinery. The machines were vast, their gears and pistons glinting faintly in the orb's glow. They looked ancient, their surfaces etched with strange, intricate patterns that seemed to shift when I tried to focus on them. The hum was louder here, vibrating through the floor and into my bones. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the noise. "The heart of the factory," the man replied. "It powers everything. Every light, every sound, every thought." "Thought?" He nodded grimly. "The factory isn't just a building. It's alive, and it needs people to keep it going." I backed away, shaking my head. "That's insane. It's just an old factory." He grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "You've already felt it, haven't you? The pull, the connection, that's how it starts. The factory chooses who it needs, and once it has you, there's no escape." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was, I had felt it. The strange compulsion to come here, the way the orb seemed to draw me in. Even now, I felt it. A subtle, insistent tug in the back of my mind, urging me closer to the machines. "Why me?" I asked, my voice trembling. The man released my arm and sighed. "It doesn't choose randomly. It finds people who are compatible, people it can use." "Use for what?" "To sustain itself," he said. "To grow, to survive." I looked around the room, my eyes lingering on the shifting patterns etched into the machines. "And what happens if I don't let it?" He gave me a look of such profound sadness that I knew the answer before he spoke. "You don't have a choice. None of us do." As if in response to his words, the orb pulsed brighter, filling the room with a cold, white light. The hum grew louder, almost deafening, and I felt a sudden, crushing pressure in my chest. I dropped to my knees, gasping for air, as images flashed through my mind. Endless rows of machinery, faceless workers toiling away, and the factory itself, vast and alive, its walls pulsating like a heartbeat. When the vision ended, I was lying on the floor, drenched in sweat. The man knelt beside me, his expression grim. "It's begun," he said. "What's begun?" I croaked. "The trial," he replied. "If you survive, you'll become one of them. If you don't..." He trailed off, but his silence said enough. The factory didn't wait. The machinery roared to life, and the orb began to move, its glow intensifying as it floated toward the largest machine in the room. The man grabbed my arm, pulling me to my feet. "Listen to me," he said urgently. "The factory will test you. It will push you to your limits, but you have to resist. If you give in, it will take you completely." "How do I resist something I don't understand?" "You don't fight it," he said. "You survive it." The orb surrounded me, its light blinding and all-consuming. The hum became a roar, drowning out everything else. I felt the factory's presence in my mind, probing, searching, demanding, but I refused to give in. I thought of everything that had brought me here, of the life I had left behind. I clung to those memories like a lifeline, using them to anchor myself against the factory's pull. Finally, the light dimmed, and the hum receded. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted but alive. The man helped me to my feet. "You passed," he said. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You leave," he said, "but the factory won't forget you. It never does." As I stumbled out of the factory, the key still clutched in my hand, I knew he was right. The factory had marked me, and no matter how far I ran, I would never truly be free. If you've watched the video till the end, hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell icon.